A grand castle with towering spires rose among the green hills, its imposing silhouette a clear testament to wealth and aristocracy. This was the Campbell estate, a place of opulence and tradition. Inside its lavish walls, a young man suddenly bolted upright in bed, his blonde hair tousled as he struggled to make sense of his surroundings. His hands gripped the blanket tightly, his breath unsteady. The memory of his death was still vivid. He stared at his hands, then at the extravagant Western-style room, something straight out of a historical drama. The realization hit him like a hammer. Either he was trapped in an elaborate dream, or he had been reincarnated in another world. He desperately hoped for the former. Stumbling towards a mirror, he examined his reflection. A young man, no older than 17 or 18, with a face that was both familiar and subtly different. And then it clicked. This was not his body. Panic crept in as he pieced together the horrifying truth. Seeking proof of reality, he grabbed a knife from the ornate dresser and pressed it against his finger, wincing as sharp pain shot through him. The stinging sensation confirmed his worst fear. This was not a dream. This was his new, unfortunate existence. If reincarnation had to happen, there were better choices. A hero, perhaps? A side character with potential? But fate had decided otherwise. He recalled a novel called The Strongest Heroine in History. A novel he had once read religiously. And within its pages existed a character doomed to failure. Moon Campbell. A useless, pathetic, womanizing fool who was exiled and forgotten by chapter 20. The mere thought made his stomach turn. The name alone was enough to make him want to scream. Bitterness settled in as he recognized his predicament. He had been reborn as a third-rate villain whose greatest accomplishment was making life slightly inconvenient for the protagonist. Before he could fully descend into despair, a knock on the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. He responded with as much composure as he could muster, allowing entry. A maid, Anne, stepped inside with the poised grace of someone accustomed to handling privileged nobles. She informed him that his outfit for the upcoming banquet had arrived. Under normal circumstances, the old moon would have dismissed her with a lazy wave. But today, he was too preoccupied with his existential crisis to pretend. His response was short, barely acknowledging her words. Anne, however, was observant. Her sharp gaze landed on his hand, where a thin line of red still glistened. She noted his injury. He brushed it off as nothing more than a scratch, assuring her he could take care of it. She, however, stepped closer with an unsettling confidence. For a brief moment, he assumed she intended to bring a bandage. That would have been the logical course of action. But what actually happened defied all reason. Without hesitation, she took his hand, brought it to her lips, and licked the wound. His mind blanked. His body froze in place as he watched her, horror creeping into his expression. He could barely form a sound, let alone a coherent thought. She released his hand with a satisfied smile, remarking that not a drop of his precious blood should be wasted. The words sent a fresh wave of disbelief through him. His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to process the situation. Meanwhile, Anne remained entirely unfazed, advising him to take better care of himself before turning to leave. When the door closed behind her, he exhaled sharply, his heart still racing. And then, like a delayed impact, realization struck him full force. Heat rushed to his face as he buried it in his hands. His mind screamed at the absurdity of it all. Outside the room, Anne hesitated for a brief moment. That had been unexpected. The young master had actually thanked her. A rare occurrence, but she dismissed the thought quickly. Inside, however, Moon Campbell was on the verge of an existential breakdown. Why had the original Moon ever provoked the protagonist in the first place? He had everything: wealth, status, a mansion, and apparently, a disturbingly devoted maid. And if memory served him right, his downfall began when he drugged the third princess at the coming-of-age ceremony. Well, he thought bitterly, that could easily be avoided. A revolutionary concept, really. Smirking to himself, he made a decision. He would stay rich, keep his head attached to his body, and avoid exile at all costs. But then, a chilling realization struck him. When was the ceremony? His gaze darted to the outfit Anne had delivered. The color drained from his face. Horror dawned upon him. Tomorrow. A moment of absolute silence passed before the castle walls shook with a single, thunderous cry of frustration. Sprawled on his bed, Moon frantically searched for any clue, any sign of guidance in this new world. He called for a system, a wise mentor, a goddess, anything that could offer him an advantage. But there was nothing. Just silence. Panic settled in as the realization struck him again. The ceremony was tomorrow. There was no time to rewrite history, no way to alter the course of events that would lead to his downfall. Would apologizing be enough? He doubted it. Another thought struck him. A far worse scenario. What if they forced him to grovel? What if he had to endure something humiliating, like licking the protagonist's feet in front of the entire nobility? A shudder ran through him. But then, a flicker of resolve. A real man, he told himself, wasn't afraid of a little humiliation. If it came to that, he would do it with dignity. His mind wavered for a brief moment on the condition that she at least wore black stockings, and then he steeled himself. He would fall to his knees before the heroine at the speed of light and bow 3 times if it meant survival. Before he could fully embrace his tragic fate, something hard smacked him right in the head. Stunned, he rubbed his forehead, scowling as he searched for the culprit. A book lay on the bed beside him, radiating a faint magical energy. At first glance, it looked like a simple tome, but as he held it, excitement surged through him. This was it. His cheat. His god hadn't abandoned him after all. Clutching the book to his chest, he felt a renewed sense of hope. He might still be cannon fodder, but at least now he had a fighting chance. Eager to unlock its secrets, he flipped it open, ready to embrace whatever power lay within. And then, nothing. The pages were blank. A long, painful silence filled the room. His eye twitched as he flipped through every page, searching for hidden text, an activation phrase, anything. But there was nothing. His fingers trembled as he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it needed a ritual. It was a Western European fantasy setting, after all. And what was the most cliché activation method? Blood. Without thinking too much, he ran his finger across his lip, creating a small scratch. A few drops of blood fell onto the pages, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the book began to tremble violently. Dark energy erupted from its pages, swirling around him in an ominous storm. Horror widened his eyes as an unbearable pain shot through his body. Blood dripped down his arms, and agony tore through his limbs. He barely had time to comprehend the situation before everything faded to black. When he awoke, he was no longer in his room. Chains bound him in a dark, cold space, his body aching from unseen wounds. His vision blurred, but as his surroundings sharpened, a figure emerged from the shadows. A girl with chilling red eyes. She smiled at him, sweet yet cruel, and whispered that she had been waiting for him to wake up. A surge of panic hit him as he struggled against the chains, but they held firm. Pain shot through his limbs, and she let out a disapproving sigh, remarking that pain was necessary. It was meant to teach a lesson. His mind reeled. What lesson? What was happening? She spoke again, her tone almost regretful. She said that this shouldn't have happened to him, but it was his own fault. His cruelty, his arrogance, his selfishness had led him here. His jaw clenched at the accusation. Ignoring his unspoken protest, she continued with eerie certainty. She claimed that his purpose had always been to hurt others, to make them despise him, to make them hate him. And in doing so, he would belong only to her. A deep chill ran down his spine as her lips curled into a grim smile. But then something in her expression shifted, her red eyes gleaming with dark devotion. She declared that it didn't matter. She would fix him, with her love, no matter how long it took. His breath hitched, stomach twisting as her voice softened with terrifying sincerity. She assured him that they would always be together, that not even death could separate them. And then, he screamed. Moon jolted awake, gasping for breath. His heart pounded violently, his body drenched in cold sweat. He clutched the sheets, struggling to convince himself that it had been just a dream. But had it? His muscles still ached, his arms burned where the chains had held him. It had felt real. His breath caught as his gaze landed on his arm. Dread slithered down his spine. If this book was supposed to be his advantage, then why did it feel like it was actively working against him? With shaking hands, he flipped the book open again. This time, ominous letters stared back at him, sending a shiver through his very soul. Do not try to change your destiny. Moon muttered the words aloud, feeling the weight of them settle over him. Dark energy seeped from the pages, a silent confirmation of his worst fears. If he tried to change anything, he would suffer for it. But if he did nothing, exile and disgrace were inevitable. He scowled, staring out the window. His initial plan, to keep his head down and stay out of trouble, had clearly been a joke. The book wasn't giving him a choice. He then remembered that in the original story, his character didn't die. He was simply exiled and became a beggar. If disappearing meant a fresh start, then that was exactly what he would do. As socialist proletarian fighter, he could still make a good living in this world with his knowledge. But first, food. With renewed determination and an empty stomach, he indulged in one of the finest meals he had ever tasted. The meat was so tender it melted in his mouth, the wine rich and smooth like liquid luxury. His mother, Duchess Noyce Campbell, watched him curiously, remarking that he looked rather pleased. His father, Duke Lon Campbell, chuckled over his wine, noting that tomorrow's banquet was an important event for him. Moon replied that he was looking forward to it, more or less. The Duchess beamed, commenting that her son was growing up so fast and that all the young ladies would surely be swooning over him. The Duke, however, had other concerns. He reminded them that Moon already had a fiancée, Princess Celia. If she became jealous, it could cause trouble. Moon blinked. Who? Then, memories resurfaced. Princess Celia. The third princess of the empire. Cold, reserved, mysterious. A woman who had countless admirers but seemed utterly uninterested in any of them. He held back a bitter laugh. Only his parents thought he was perfect. They were good people, too good. And thanks to the scandal that would unfold at the banquet, they would be exiled. But why? The book insisted that he couldn't change his own fate, but it never said anything about changing theirs. Everyone assumed his scandal at the banquet was what led to their downfall. But the truth was different. His father would be accused of treason, the victim of a political conspiracy among the nobility. Moon had a plan. It wasn't the best plan, but when the alternative was either uncovering the real culprit or getting exiled and dying as a beggar, he had to make do. He needed to either expose the mastermind behind his family's downfall or find someone else to take the fall. The crime he was supposed to commit, insulting the princess, wasn't as simple as slipping poison into her drink. Ordinary poison wouldn't work anyway. The third princess was a magical genius who could probably detect toxins with a single breath. No, he needed something special. Unfortunately, his memories of the mansion contained exactly 0 references to hidden stockpiles of rare poisons. That meant finding another source. Preferably one that didn't involve him getting shanked in a back alley. He recalled a place from the novel, who dealt in the kind of merchandise he needed. The problem? It wasn't exactly nearby, and sneaking out before a grand ceremony was asking for trouble. As he mulled over his predicament, a sudden clatter snapped him out of his thoughts. A servant girl carrying a tea tray had tripped after bumping into him, spilling the tea. She winced, rubbing her ankle, letting out a miserable whimper about the wasted tea. Still half distracted, Moon mumbled that it was his fault. He hadn't been paying attention. The reaction was unexpected. The maid stiffened as if he had just declared he was about to personally throw her out a window. In a panicked stammer, she begged for forgiveness, promising to clean up immediately and pleading not to be punished or dismissed. She swore she would do better. Moon blinked, caught off guard. Wait, what? She looked one step away from prostrating herself, which only drove home how terrible his predecessor must have been. Rubbing his temples, he sighed, telling her to relax. He wasn't going to punish her. The girl hesitated before hesitantly asking if he was serious. He confirmed it, then frowned as he took a closer look at her. She looked pale, feverish, on the verge of collapse. He asked why she was even working when she was clearly unwell. Noelle, the maid, introduced herself hesitantly, looking genuinely taken aback by Moon's concern. It was as if the idea of basic human decency was completely foreign to her. She quickly tried to brush off the issue, explaining that there weren't enough workers due to the upcoming banquet preparations. Moon responded flatly that it was a dumb excuse. Sick people shouldn't be working. The logical solution was to hire more servants. A thick silence followed, so heavy it could have been cut with a dull butter knife. Anne, another maid, exchanged glances with Noelle before replying cautiously. She reminded him that he had explicitly forbidden hiring outsiders, claiming they were filthy. Moon fought the urge to groan. His past self was truly the worst. Without hesitation, he announced that he had changed his mind and ordered them to bring in more workers. Anne nodded, ever composed, but Moon caught the way she eyed him, as if bracing for an impending disaster. It was obvious she intended to keep a close watch on him from now on. He ignored it. There were more important things to worry about. He needed something that could help him escape his fate, a VIP pass to the black market. His past self, despite being utterly useless, had at least managed to acquire one redeeming item. After ransacking his belongings, he finally found it. A sleek black card, practically radiating illegal activity. Twirling it between his fingers, he muttered aloud, wondering if his original self had been a complete scumbag. The answer was almost certainly yes. With his golden ticket in hand, he made his way to the Chessford trading house, using the excuse of purchasing jewelry for his parents. Then, slipping away unnoticed, he headed toward the infamous city of Belron. Finding the entrance to the black market was easy enough. It was hidden within the stinking, rat-infested sewers outside the capital. Lovely. Lighting a torch, he pressed forward until he reached a massive iron door, guarded by a brute of a man with the warmth of a slab of cold meat. The guard demanded to know who he was. Moon deadpanned, called himself a sewer rat. The guard snorted, and asked for his purpose. Moon answered that he was looking for carrion. That seemed to be the magic word. With a grunt, the guard stepped aside, allowing him through the towering doors. Inside, the underground black market sprawled before him, a chaotic maze of illicit goods and merchants hawking everything from magical creatures to human lives. Ignoring the more disturbing sights, he made a direct path toward the potion vendors. A masked saleswoman greeted him with unsettling enthusiasm, noting that he was her first customer of the day and calling it delightful. She asked what he was looking for. Lowering his voice, he explained that he needed a special potion, colorless, odorless, and strong enough to knock out a mage for a few hours. She chuckled knowingly, remarking that many noblemen came to the market looking for entertainment. She even offered to connect him with a reliable slaver if he was interested. Moon's stomach churned at the suggestion. He immediately declined. As he turned to leave, her cheerful tone dropped into something more sinister. She remarked that he was lucky because she just so happened to have exactly what he was looking for. Something about the merchant immediately set him on edge. She was completely hidden beneath a cloak, her voice altered by magic, and even her body was disguised. It was as if someone had taken pure paranoia and wrapped it into a neat little package. Yet, as she moved, gesturing and rummaging through her supplies, certain details became apparent. Despite all her efforts to hide it, she was definitely a woman. Interesting. A mysterious merchant hiding her identity in a place like this could only mean one thing. She had something to lose. And people with something to lose were people worth knowing. A plan began to form in Moon's mind. If he could establish a good relationship with her, she might prove useful after his inevitable exile. Because, let's be honest, at this rate, he was about as doomed as a candle in a hurricane. The merchant told him to wait a moment while she searched for the potion. Moon wasn't in a hurry. The most important thing was making sure he got what he came for. But before she could return, another figure appeared, a hooded individual, draped in black, radiating an aura that practically screamed, "I definitely don't pay my taxes." The merchant greeted the new arrival without hesitation. The hooded figure wasted no time, stating their request in a low, steady voice. They needed a powerful drug that left no magical traces. Moon's interest piqued immediately. How delightfully suspicious. The merchant, momentarily surprised, quickly regained her composure. She remarked that it was a rare request and began sifting through her wares. Meanwhile, Moon studied the newcomer. The subtle scent of lavender and steel clung to the fabric of her cloak, and despite the concealment, it was obvious. This was also a woman. Judging by her confidence, she likely had access to such substances already but was searching for something even more potent. The merchant finally turned to Moon, presenting him with a vial. It was so aggressively bright that if highlighters were weapons, this one would be lethal. Moon raised an eyebrow, questioning its supposed undetectability. The merchant waved a hand dismissively, assuring him that in red wine, it would be completely untraceable. She added, almost casually, that it was strong enough to knock out an elephant for hours. Moon blinked. He appreciated overkill as much as the next person, but an elephant? As if reading his thoughts, the merchant shrugged and remarked that power always came at a price. Speaking of price, she then named her demand, 130,000. Moon was about to mentally curse his lack of funds when the hooded woman made her move. She stated that she would pay with information. The merchant, intrigued, leaned forward, asking just how valuable this information was. The woman responded that it was worth more than gold. Moon watched as the two struck a deal. At first, the merchant examined the note skeptically, but after a moment, her expression shifted. A slow grin spread across her face. Whatever she had just learned was far more valuable than any bag of coins. The hooded woman, satisfied, took her potion and disappeared into the shadows with practiced ease. Moon, never one to waste an opportunity, flashed his VIP pass at the merchant. Her interest piqued. Without warning, she tossed him a small extra vial. Suspicious, he asked what it was. She smiled, explaining that it was an enhancement, something to make the red potion even stronger. He thanked her, then, ever the opportunist, casually fished for information about the hooded woman. The merchant smirked before making a counteroffer. If he wanted to know more, he could simply buy the woman from her for 90,000. Moon narrowed his eyes, immediately pointing out that she had just made that number up. The merchant's grin widened. Fine, then 90,000. Without hesitation, Moon turned to leave, deciding he had heard enough. As he stepped out, he could practically hear the merchant's laughter behind him. The kind of laughter that said, "I just made a profit, and you'll never know how much." Outside, Moon processed everything that had just happened. The black market was a cesspool of opportunists, and if he wanted to navigate it properly, he would need someone more reliable in his corner. Meanwhile, back in her shop, the merchant remained seated, chuckling to herself. She hadn't expected today to be particularly eventful, but it seemed things were about to become far more interesting. After all, the third princess herself would be at the banquet. New servants were being hired at the Campbell estate, and an aristocrat was snooping around for undetectable drugs. The second prince, who despised his talented sister, might find this information worth purchasing. The duke, who had fallen out with the Campbell family, might also be willing to pay for it. Why pick sides when one could sell to both? A wicked smile crossed her face. She was about to kill two birds with one stone, and make a fortune doing it. The grand halls of Campbell Palace shimmered with opulence, chandeliers casting a golden glow over the noble guests. They had nothing better to do than sip expensive wine and whisper judgments about each other behind forced smiles. The event was as suffocatingly sophisticated as expected: silk dresses, polished shoes, and enough strained pleasantries to make even the paintings on the walls look uncomfortable. Moon stood at the center of it all, playing the role of a charming young noble. It was a drastic departure from his predecessor's usual arrogant persona. He had barely adjusted to his surroundings when a marquis approached, dragging along his daughter as though presenting an unwilling sacrifice. The marquis introduced her. Lady Evelyn. His tone carrying the enthusiasm of a man delivering bad news. The girl, however, seemed to have very different thoughts about this introduction. The moment her eyes met Moon's, her face turned the color of an overripe tomato. Beads of nervous sweat formed on her forehead as her hands fidgeted with the fabric of her dress. Her attempt at speech came out fractured. She stammered out an awkward greeting, her voice cracking like cheap porcelain. Moon raised an eyebrow, waiting for the usual pleasure to meet you or at least a half-hearted courtesy. Instead, her wide eyes darted around, frantically searching for an escape route. A moment later, she squeaked out that her mother was calling for her, before promptly spinning on her heel and bolting out of the hall with urgency. A brief silence followed. The marquis coughed into his hand, visibly embarrassed, before apologizing for his daughter's behavior. He explained that she was simply shy, though it was painfully obvious to everyone that shy wasn't quite the right word. Moon, keeping his expression composed, offered a diplomatic smile and assured the marquis that he understood completely. Internally, however, he was struggling not to laugh. Ah, yes. The original Moon Campbell. So insufferable that young noblewomen would rather fake parental summons than spend even a minute in his presence. If there were a competition for the most avoided aristocrat, Moon Campbell would have won by unanimous decision. His amusement was short-lived as he caught the suspicious glances of the other guests. It wasn't just Lady Evelyn. Many in the crowd were looking at him with the same wary, distrustful expressions, as if waiting for him to do something obnoxiously villainous. He supposed he couldn't blame them. The original Moon had set the bar so low that simply standing still and smiling was already an improvement. His father, Duke Lon Campbell, approached then, offering a rare nod of approval. He stated that Moon was doing well. Moon blinked in surprise, questioning if that was really the case. The Duke nodded, clearly pleased. He told his son that tonight was his night, a chance to prove himself as a true Campbell, and that he must show his worth. Moon resisted the urge to make a sarcastic remark about how his mere presence was already a miracle. Instead, he nodded respectfully and assured his father that he would do his best. Before anything else could be said, The sharp sound of a staff striking marble echoed through the hall. A hush fell over the crowd as an announcer's voice rang out, declaring the arrival of Her Imperial Highness, 3rd Princess Celia Leopold. The air itself seemed to freeze. Celia entered with an aura of elegance, her steps measured, her posture flawless. Blessed by the goddess of ice and snow, she carried herself with untouchable beauty. The kind that left commoners awestruck and nobles wary. Her silver-blue gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers, perfectly complementing the cold sharpness of her gaze as she surveyed the room, silently assessing who among the attendees was even worth acknowledging. As the last of the esteemed guests arrived, Moon's father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. A rare smile crossed the Duke's usually stern face as he said he would be leaving to greet the other Dukes. He reminded Moon not to neglect the princess. Moon responded with practiced confidence, placing a hand over his chest in a show of aristocratic discipline. Celia made her way toward him, each step measured and poised, almost as if she were floating rather than walking. She greeted him formally, remarking that it had been a long time. Moon, determined to maintain the charade of charm, responded with a polite smile, returning the greeting and adding that she was extraordinarily beautiful today. Her response was cold. She acknowledged the compliment but noted that it was rare to hear such words from him. Then, lifting the hem of her gown ever so slightly, she performed a flawless bow, radiating noble grace. Moon, keeping up appearances, returned the bow with equal politeness, hand over his chest. With a lighthearted tone, he commented that her words made him seem like the kind of rude person who couldn't control his own mouth. He asked if that wasn't a bit unfair. Celia's piercing gaze met his, and for the first time that evening. With a light chuckle, he noted that the princess must be tired after traveling from the royal city and suggested that she take a moment to rest. The banquet wouldn't officially begin for a while. A pause. Then, without another word, Celia turned on her heel and walked toward the rest area, simply stating that it would be appreciated. As soon as she disappeared from sight, Moon let out a quiet exhale, rubbing the back of his head. He muttered to himself that she was finally gone. Beautiful, yes, truly beautiful, but also terrifying. No wonder she was the novel's first female lead. Meanwhile, Celia moved through the hall, exchanging the expected greetings with nobles, her poise never wavering. But her mind was elsewhere. Something about Moon seemed different. She stole a glance back at him, still standing among the guests. His usual arrogance had been replaced with something eerily close to politeness. Before she could dwell on the thought, a shift in the room's atmosphere pulled her attention elsewhere. A murmur spread through the crowd, quiet whispers carrying through the banquet hall. Moon, sensing the shift, subtly tuned in. Nobles always whispered behind one another's backs, but this was different. There was something sharper in their voices, something that carried weight. He listened. They spoke of an illegitimate daughter. Disbelief laced their words as they questioned why she was here. One mentioned a duel with her betrothed. Another remarked that Duke Bugart had just named her his heir. Disdain filled their tones as they expressed their outrage. Not only was she illegitimate, but a woman? How had she qualified to inherit earldom? Moon's gaze flickered toward the entrance. Sure enough, the subject of their gossip had arrived. Two girls stepped inside, walking side by side, one tall, one short. Moon had expected this night to be exhausting, but now it was beginning to look like an actual battlefield. His gaze locked onto the two figures entering the hall. He knew them all too well. The tall girl on the left carried herself with an overwhelming aura, the kind that could shatter a lesser man's ego on sight. The undisputed, battle-hardened, and absolutely terrifying true protagonist of this world, Ariel Bugart. Ariel showed no reaction to the judgmental stares or whispered insults from the noble crowd. Instead, walked forward then, with casual ease, she raised a hand in greeting and acknowledged Moon, remarking that they met again and asking how he had been lately. Moon, slightly caught off guard, was about to respond, perhaps even manage a passable polite greeting, when disaster struck. An obese nobleman wearing glasses suddenly burst forward, practically foaming at the mouth. His stubby finger jabbed in Ariel's direction as he bellowed in outrage, demanding to know how a lowly, illegitimate daughter dared to address young Master Moon so casually. For a brief moment, Moon's soul left his body. This was exactly the kind of thing that got people killed. Without thinking, pure survival instincts kicked in. He lunged forward, slapping a hand over the nobleman's mouth before he could dig an even deeper grave. Through gritted teeth, he ordered him to shut up. Moon, still restraining the struggling nobleman, forced a stiff smile and responded politely, addressing Ariel by her full name and thanking her for her concern. Ariel blinked. The Moon Campbell she knew, the insufferable, sneering, pompous noble brat, had just spoken to her with perfect courtesy. By her full name, no less. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She lowered her head slightly, covering her mouth with her hand as she thought to herself. What is happening here? Has he come to his senses? Or is this some elaborate scheme? Meanwhile, Lee, standing awkwardly beside Ariel, remained thoroughly confused by the chaotic scene unfolding before her. Moon then turned to her, his expression warm. He greeted her gently, calling her by name and offering his hand in introduction. Lee's eyes widened in pure shock. She blurted out her surprise, noting that young Master Moon actually knew her name. Moon, maintaining his polite demeanor, slightly bent forward, his outstretched hand waiting for her to shake. He remarked that he could hardly be unaware of such an important guest at tonight's banquet. Before Lee could even consider taking his hand, it was slapped away, hard. Moon recoiled slightly, blinking in confusion. Ariel now stood between them. With cold precision, she demanded to know what he was up to. Moon stared at her, utterly baffled. As she leaned toward him, he instinctively leaned back, nervous sweat forming at his brow. He hesitantly addressed her, but she didn't let him finish. Ariel stated that she had only come out of respect for his father. She then made it clear that she didn't know what game he was playing, but she wouldn't tolerate it. With a hard jab to his shoulder, she narrowed her eyes and warned him, if he tried anything against Lee, she would personally make sure he regretted it. She didn't wait for a response. With that, Ariel spun around and strode toward the hall's interior. Without looking back, she instructed Lee to follow. Lee hesitated for a moment, glancing at Moon with uncertainty before hurrying after Ariel. And just like that, they were gone. Exhaling sharply, Moon closed his eyes for a moment before forcing an awkward smile. It seemed the original Moon Campbell had left him a truly terrible history with her. Shaking off the thought, he turned on his heel. Looking straight ahead, he thought that there is no point in dwelling on it. After tonight, their paths would diverge. Two parallel lines, never meant to cross again. She would be this world's great savior, and he would play the role of a diligent noble heir, bound by his family's expectations. A beautiful future for both of them. The ceremony commenced in no time. Moon stood on the observation deck of the second floor, his parents beaming with pride behind him, basking in the glow of their well-bred son. Below, nobles gathered. Taking a deep breath, he bowed to the crowd. The room fell silent. With as much dignity as he could muster, he began. His voice rang clearly through the hall, each word carrying the weight of an 18-year-old noble forced into adulthood too soon. Under the guidance of his dear parents, he declared that he had come of age. Finally, he reached the grand closing line. He declared to the gathered nobles that from this day onward, he would officially be considered the heir of the Campbell family. His parents clapped proudly. The nobles followed suit, their polite applause echoing through the hall. Moon stood there, smiling like the perfect heir should, but inwardly, he knew the truth. It was a lie. Yes, he had said the correct lines. Yes, he had played his role well. But after tonight, everything would shift. His so-called heir status was nothing more than a limited-time promotion. Still, the speech ended with enthusiasm, and at last, he was free to loosen his tie and exhale. Under his breath, he muttered that it was finally over. With that, the ballroom truly came alive. Nobles paired off, twirling across the floor like elegant marionettes. Laughter and polite conversation filled the air. Moon, standing to the side, took the moment to strategize. Now for the main task. His gaze swept across the ballroom, searching. Celia, where was she? His eyes landed near the grand French windows. There she was, Princess Celia, untouched by the festive atmosphere. She stood alone, a glass of red wine in hand, gazing silently out at the night. The golden light from the chandeliers softened against her profile as she admired the view. Moon sighed. He had abandoned the imperial princess at her own banquet. Truly, he was a flawless host. Walking up to her, he bowed slightly, adopting an air of exaggerated regret. He remarked that he had made a terrible mistake. Leaving the esteemed princess alone was highly disrespectful of him. Celia turned to face him, one eyebrow arched. She addressed him plainly, calling him by name. Moon, ever the picture of noble charm, elegantly extended his hand. His other hand rested behind his back as he gave a slight bow. He mused aloud, wondering if he might be fortunate enough to have this dance with her. Celia blinked, briefly caught off guard. She questioned whether he was truly inviting her. Moon's smile remained warm, perhaps too warm. He assured her that of course, he was. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she sighed, shutting her eyes briefly before reaching forward. With delicate grace, she placed her hand in his. She murmured that since it was his coming-of-age ceremony, she supposed she had no reason to refuse. Moon's smile widened slightly. He thanked her. The dance floor became the center of attention. The nobles watched with thinly veiled fascination. Hushed whispers spread quickly. Meanwhile, Lee, standing among the crowd, tugged urgently at Ariel's sleeve. Excitedly, she urged her to look. Ariel, in the middle of enjoying a particularly delicious piece of cake, barely glanced up. Under the golden glow of the chandeliers, Moon and Celia moved effortlessly across the floor, hands intertwined as they danced with practiced elegance. Celia followed his lead with natural grace, tilting her head slightly to meet his gaze. Quietly, she remarked that his dance steps were good. Moon, flashing his signature polite smile, thanked her for the praise but assured her that this was only the beginner's level. As they danced, Celia studied him closely. Tonight's interactions had confirmed something she had been suspecting for a while. She stated that he had indeed changed. Moon raised an eyebrow, already sensing where this was going. With exaggerated curiosity, he asked in what way. Had he not been behaving like a nobleman? Celia's expression remained unreadable. She clarified that it wasn't about his manners, it was how he invited people. Moon blinked, confused. She explained further. She recalled the last time he had invited the daughter of a viscount to the academy ball. Then, without hesitation, she deepened her voice, perfectly mimicking his old pompous tone. She quoted his exact words. "Woman, rejoice and cheer. I have mercifully rewarded you with a dance with me." Moon physically recoiled. His soul momentarily left his body. Avoiding eye contact, he turned his head slightly, struggling to come up with a response. Celia, however, showed no mercy. Her smirk faded, her tone turning cold as she asked if she had imitated him well. Moon forced a smile, the picture of strained politeness. He admitted it was his mistake and suggested, with clear desperation, that they pretend it never happened. Unfortunately for him, Celia had a sharp memory and an even sharper tongue. Before she could continue his verbal execution, the orchestra transitioned smoothly into the next section of the song, prompting the dancers to shift positions. Celia leaned slightly into him, and Moon, ever the gentleman, held her hand a little tighter to guide her through the new steps. Then, lowering his head, he whispered in her ear. He asked if, after this dance, he might invite her to his room. Celia instantly stiffened. Her expression darkened, and she prepared to reject him outright. She reminded him icily that although they were engaged, sensing the impending royal smackdown, Moon quickly interrupted. He assured her that he had no intention of overstepping any boundaries. He smoothly added that what he wished to discuss was their engagement. Celia blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Her icy exterior wavered just slightly before she raised an eyebrow, intrigued. As they moved with the rhythm, her voice a quiet murmur. She asked if he truly needed a private discussion with her regarding their engagement. He knew she would be skeptical, so he painted his deception carefully, grounding it in undeniable truths. He acknowledged that she did not like him and stated that their engagement was nothing more than a political arrangement, a decision orchestrated by the emperor to maintain ties with his father. Celia's gaze flickered, but she remained silent. Encouraged by the lack of immediate rejection, Moon pressed on. He explained that their engagement was merely a tool to maintain balance. If she were to openly propose its cancellation, it would cast doubt on the royal family's credibility and strain her relationship with the emperor. He asked if he was wrong. Lowering his voice further, he whispered near her ear. He pointed out that at least when it came to ending their engagement, they shared the same goal. If they worked together, they could find a way to part without scandal or disgrace. He asked if that would not be preferable. Celia's eyes widened just slightly before she closed them, exhaling slowly, as if weighing his words against her own unspoken thoughts. Finally, she answered. She acknowledged that the matter could only be discussed privately between the two of them. Moon concealed his satisfaction with a polite smile, but inside, He felt a small victory. She believed him. She had taken the bait. Just as he relished his small success, Celia spoke again, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. She asked where his room was. Moon froze. His mind stumbled over itself, trying to process her sudden question. His room? Now? Before he could formulate a response, Celia had already made her decision. Without hesitation, she took his arm and began leading him out of the ballroom, her grip firm and unwavering. Moon barely managed to keep up as she strode forward with purpose, paying no attention to the curious glances thrown their way. He called out to her in alarm, but she did not slow down. At the far end of the hall, where the golden light of the chandeliers faded into shadows, two figures watched in silence. One of the maids, a short-haired woman with keen, observant eyes, lowered her broom, narrowing her gaze at the sight of Moon being pulled away. She muttered that the princess was leaving with that young master. Beside her, a long-haired maid stole a glance before nodding. Neither of them spoke further, but the air between them was thick with understanding. Whatever Celia and Moon were up to, it was something that needed to be dealt with. The short-haired maid exhaled, rolling up her sleeves. She told her companion to keep watch, stating that she would handle it. The long-haired maid barely spared her a glance. She reminded her to be quick, as this was the Lionheart King's territory. With that, the two maids silently melted into the crowd. Meanwhile, Moon barely had time to register his surroundings before they arrived at his chambers. To steady himself, he reached for a bottle of red wine from a nearby shelf, along with 2 glasses. If nothing else, maintaining a sense of formality was key. Masking any nervousness, he asked if Celia would like a drink. Her response was immediate and sharp. She refused, stating simply that she did not drink. Moon nearly fumbled the bottle. Trying again, he forced an easy smile, mentioning that it was just red wine and a little wouldn't hurt. Celia's tone remained firm as she repeated that red wine was also not allowed. Moon watched as she closed her eyes briefly, then tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with practiced elegance. She explained that her constitution could not tolerate alcohol. Moon's fingers tightened around the bottle. What? His face remained neutral, but internally, alarm bells rang. She doesn't drink. His eyes flickered toward the wine, then to the cabinet where, just minutes ago, he had hidden the real tool of his plan. A small vial filled with a vivid red liquid. The potion that was supposed to ensure her temporary unconsciousness. The novel never specified exactly how Celia lost consciousness that night. He had assumed it was through the wine. But if she never drank in the first place? His pulse quickened. This isn't good. Moon forced a tight, polite smile as he turned to Celia, his voice carefully natural. He asked what she would like to drink instead. Celia remained neutral, pondering for a brief moment. She started to say that she only drank black tea or coffee. Moon quickly composed himself, stepping forward with practiced grace. Placing a hand over his chest, he bowed slightly, adopting an apologetic posture. He smoothly explained that, due to unforeseen circumstances, no other beverages were available tonight except for red wine and black tea. His voice was calm, carefully measured, but inside, his heart pounded. He could feel her gaze on him, sharp and assessing. Even though his words had come out flawlessly, he couldn't shake the fear that she might sense something was off. Celia rested her chin on her hand, tilting her head slightly in thought. After a short pause, she nodded, seemingly unconcerned. She said she would have the black tea. Moon barely managed to suppress the relieved sigh threatening to escape. Instead, he let his face light up with polite enthusiasm, his voice carrying just the right amount of joy. He told her he would go get it now. Celia watched him move with quiet scrutiny, her face unreadable. His reaction was odd. He was acting far too excited over something as simple as brewing tea. Is making tea really such a joyful thing for this guy? She wondered silently. Moon worked swiftly, pouring the freshly brewed black tea into 2 porcelain teacups. He placed them on the counter, keeping his back turned to Salassia. The critical moment had arrived. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Carefully, he opened the lid of the vial and tilted it over one of the teacups. A single drop of the shimmering red liquid slipped into the dark tea, dissolving instantly. His lips pressed tightly together as he added a few more drops. He wasn't sure what the white substance in the other potion was, so he decided it was better to be cautious and avoid using it. Before he could consider it further, Salassia called out from the other room, asking if the tea was ready. Moon flinched, his fingers jerking, and the white potion's cap popped off. His heart nearly stopped. Startled, a small sound escaped him before he could suppress it. Panicked, he spun around, shoving both bottles behind his back, clutching them tightly as if his life depended on it. When he turned, Salassia was there, her gaze piercing and unreadable. He forced a smile, his voice strained as he told her the tea was almost ready. Salassia didn't respond, merely watching him for a moment before turning away and returning to her seat. Relief washed over Moon, but his nerves remained on edge. His palms were damp with sweat as he turned back to the counter. He closed his eyes briefly, his breath shaky as he wiped his forehead. The encounter had been too close. He knew that if Salassia had seen what he was doing or noticed anything unusual, his fate would have been sealed. His fingers still trembled when his gaze dropped to the floor. His breath hitched. A dark stain gleamed faintly on the polished wood, red, unmistakably the same color as the potion. His mind raced in disbelief as he wondered if he had spilled it. His body stiffened, and his fingers twitched before he reached out, despair settling in as he stared at the wasted potion. This was supposed to be his first chance at fortune. His plan had been perfect. Dilute the potion, divide it into small portions, and sell it as a sleeping aid. Easy money. Before he could dwell further, Celestia's voice broke his trance, calling him by name. Her tone was smooth yet firm, carrying an air of expectation. Moon jolted upright, pushing his grief aside as he rushed to respond. He hurried over, unaware of the shadowy figure that lingered just beyond the window, a silent observer who vanished into the darkness. Moon carefully presented Celestia with her teacup. As she reached for it, her gaze paused on the tea itself. She remarked that the black tea looked unusually red, almost glowing. His breath stopped as she analyzed the liquid, noting how unnaturally vivid it appeared. Tiny glimmers, like stardust, swirled within the tea, something she had never seen before. Moon's pulse quickened. He forced himself to remain calm, struggling to find an explanation. He hastily claimed that the tea was a rare and valuable blend from the Eastern Kingdom, called Big Red Robe. Celestia traced the rim of the cup with her fingers, her lips curling slightly. She remarked that if the tea was so rare, then surely Moon should drink first. His throat went dry. He tried to dismiss her suspicion with a nervous smile, weakly joking that he would never attempt anything dishonest. Celestia, unimpressed, sighed and stated that proper etiquette required the host to drink first. Knowing he had no choice, Moon reluctantly agreed. Just as he raised the cup to his lips, Celestia's voice stopped him. She quietly instructed him to wait. His heart clenched as he turned back to face her, only to watch in horror as she reached out and took his cup for herself. For the first time that night, Celia smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Moon's heart stop. She suggested that they swap cups. Moon tried to speak, but his voice faltered between a protest and sheer panic. He struggled to form words, but before he could react, Celia had already lifted the cup to her lips and taken a delicate sip. The room fell into absolute silence. Moon watched in horror as she remained frozen, motionless. His heart pounded violently, and his hand reached out instinctively as he shakily addressed her. He noticed her expression shift, her eyes turning hazy, her breath unsteady. A faint red flush crept across her face. Before she could say another word, her body swayed, and the teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. She collapsed onto the sofa, unconscious. For a moment, Moon stood frozen, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then, slowly, he exhaled. He muttered to himself that the potion had worked. His eyes scanned her still form, and he realized the mixture was far stronger than he'd expected. Seeing it take effect so quickly, especially on someone as powerful as Celia, was unsettling. He wiped the sweat from his brow and tried to gather his thoughts. The plan had succeeded, but now what? He remembered what was supposed to happen next. According to the novel's plot, Ariel, the Overlord girl and the last person Moon wanted to deal with, was supposed to arrive soon. He knew he had to prepare the scene exactly as it was described in the story. He carefully adjusted the folds of Celia's gown, nothing improper, just enough to create the illusion of disarray that matched the novel's details. He ruffled his hair, loosened his collar, and ensured he appeared just the right amount of disheveled. Everything had to be perfect. Glancing at the door, he took a deep breath. Everything was set. Now, all he had to do was wait for the misunderstanding to unfold. Moon remained in the dimly lit room, fingers tapping anxiously on the wooden table as he stared at the door. Any minute now, Ariel was supposed to arrive, sword drawn, ready to expose him and turn this moment into a chaotic climax. But time kept passing. He glanced at his silver pocket watch, his brow furrowing. Too much time had gone by. He whispered to himself, wondering why Ariel hadn't arrived yet. By now, she should have been here, confronting him, rescuing Celia, and turning this whole staged scenario into a predictable mess. But half an hour had passed, and nothing had happened. Unease began to build inside him. Moon retraced the events in his mind, piecing together the timeline. Then, a memory surfaced. Noelle, the maid. He recalled that in the original novel, a blonde maid had accidentally spilled tea on Ariel's dress, forcing her to leave for the bathroom, where she was supposed to stumble upon his staged scene. But yesterday, Moon had dismissed all the sick maids, including Noelle. A cold realization settled over him. He had changed the plot. His gaze shifted to Celia's unconscious form. The glow of the lanterns flickered across her face, illuminating the unnatural flush in her cheeks and the faint crease in her brow. His hands clenched tightly. If the story had already veered off course, what else might change? He told himself to stay calm. There had to be a way to fix this. But before he could think further, something shifted in the room. The air felt colder, sharper, a creeping chill that slithered through the space. It wrapped around him like an unseen force, seeping into his skin. Before he could finish the thought, hands reached out toward him. His eyes widened in alarm as a surge of glacial energy exploded behind him. A powerful wave of cold magic tore through the room, splintering chairs, cracking wood, and coating every surface in a layer of ice. The once warm room transformed into a frozen abyss in seconds. Moon barely had time to react before something heavy crashed into him. Celia had awoken, her body still feverish from the potion. Pressed against Moon, she instinctively released another pulse of chilling energy. A mist of frost swirled around them, biting into his skin and draining the warmth from the air. Moon's mind raced in alarm. Desperately, he tried to explain himself, insisting that it wasn't what she thought. He attempted to tell her that she had consumed the potion by mistake, but before he could finish, Celia murmured softly that she felt unbearably hot. Moon's chest tightened with unease. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal. He pressed his palms against the frozen floor, attempting to push himself up, insisting that he needed to fetch a doctor. Before he could rise, the ice thickened around his wrists, seizing him in place with a sharp, freezing sting. His breath hitched as he realized Celia had restrained him. Moving closer, her steps slow and deliberate, Celia whispered that his body felt so wonderfully cool. Moon's breathing grew faster as he pleaded with her to wake up, his voice shaking. He tried to call for Ariel or anyone who might help, but before the words could fully escape, Celia leaned in closer and softly pressed a kiss against his lips. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Duke's mansion, Ariel walked briskly down the grand hallway. She dabbed at her dress with a handkerchief, muttering in frustration about her misfortune. The spilled drink had forced her to search for a bathroom, and her irritation lingered as she hurried along. Suddenly, she stopped. A strange sensation crept over her, prickling at the edges of her awareness. She lifted her head, scanning the corridor ahead. The hallway was empty, yet something felt off. She called out, her voice steady, asking if anyone was there. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft creak broke the stillness. A maid stepped gracefully out of one of the rooms, her posture calm and composed. The maid greeted Ariel with a gentle smile and politely requested that she not proceed any further. She explained that the area ahead was restricted within the Duke's mansion and asked her to turn back. Ariel frowned at the unexpected restriction. As a guest, she had never been informed that parts of the estate were off limits. She questioned the maid, asking what exactly was restricted and why. The maid maintained her calm expression and explained that the information was confidential and that she wasn't authorized to say more. Ariel's displeasure grew, but before she could press the matter further, the maid's gaze shifted downward, noticing the stains on Ariel's skirt. Without hesitation, the maid knelt gracefully to inspect the damage. She remarked that the dress was stained and, without waiting for a reply, offered to help. Before Ariel could refuse, the maid raised her hands, summoning a faint glow of emerald energy at her fingertips. Soft green magic swept over Ariel's dress, the stains dissolving effortlessly as if they had never existed. Ariel stared in surprise. running her fingers over the now spotless fabric. She murmured her amazement, impressed by the maid's skill. Curiosity flickered in her eyes as she remarked on the Campbell family's reputation, noting that even their maids possessed magical abilities. The maid responded humbly, downplaying her talent as nothing special. Moments later, the maid wiped her hands with a handkerchief and mentioned, almost casually, that the banquet would soon be serving a limited number of pachichi cakes. She advised Ariel not to miss the opportunity if she enjoyed them. The words froze Ariel in place. Pachichi cake, her favorite dessert, was being served, and there would only be a limited number. Her face lit up with excitement as she gasped in disbelief. Without hesitation, she spun around, already planning her dash back to the banquet hall. As she turned, she called back to the maid, thanking her for the help but insisting she had something urgent to do. She needed that cake. The maid offered a gentle wave in response, her smile warm and polite. She wished Ariel well and reminded her to take care. Once Ariel's footsteps faded down the corridor, the maid slowly lowered her hand. The warm expression drained from her face, her soft smile vanishing like a candle snuffed out. Her gaze turned cold and unreadable. Ariel sprinted through the halls. Even in her excitement, her sharp mind drifted back to her brief encounter with Anne. Something about that maid unsettled her. Ariel recalled muttering to herself about the faint scent of blood that lingered around Anne. It wasn't strong or overwhelming, but with her heightened senses, she couldn't miss it. A faint, metallic trace hidden beneath layers of perfume and soap. Something was off. There had also been another presence nearby, someone watching. She had sensed them, carefully concealed, observing from the shadows. Whatever was going on in the Campbell household seemed suspicious, but Ariel decided it wasn't her concern. As for Princess Salassia, Ariel remembered spotting her leaving the ballroom with Moon. She paused briefly, wondering if she should be worried, but quickly dismissed the thought. She reminded herself that Salassia was a powerful magic prodigy, far too strong to be in any real danger. If anything, she thought, it was Moon who ought to be careful. With her concerns pushed aside, Ariel focused on what mattered most, the cake. Her expression hardened with determination, her fists clenched, and her pace quickened. Nothing, she told herself, was more important than her pachichi cake. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the mansion, a woman with short, dark hair stood against a cold stone wall, her fingers curled tightly around the hilt of a dagger. Eventually, the fading sound of footsteps confirmed what she had hoped. The threat had passed. Relaxing slightly, she murmured to herself that the visitor was gone. Across the room, a taller woman with long, flowing hair knelt on one knee, carefully tracing symbols onto the stone floor. A dim red glow flickered at her fingertips as she etched the intricate lines of a magic circle. With each stroke, the design grew more complex. The short-haired woman glanced at her with suspicion and asked if the visitor had been one of her targets. The long-haired woman didn't pause in her work. She explained calmly that the visitor had originally been targeted by number 9. Hearing that name made the short-haired woman tense. Her fingers twitched against her dagger's hilt. She repeated the name, her voice hinting at unease. The memory of a past mission, one that had ended poorly, lingered at the back of her mind. The long-haired woman continued speaking, explaining that the girl had managed to surpass her opponent by 2 whole realms, yet had still been defeated in the end. Silence stretched between them before the short-haired woman clicked her tongue and dismissed the thought. Her eyes returned to the glowing array, and her frown deepened. She warned that the process was taking too long. The long-haired woman, still focused on her work, replied that this was no simple spell. She explained that the enchantment had been originally crafted by Lionheart King Ron Campbell, covering the entire duchy. Quietly breaching it without drawing attention, she added, was no easy task. The short-haired woman's frustration mounted. She warned that time was running out. If Moon Campbell or Princess Salassia suddenly appeared, their mission would be ruined. The long-haired woman remarked quietly that there was no need to worry. While scouting earlier, she had seen something that suggested their targets wouldn't be a problem. In a dimly lit room, she recalled spotting Salassia atop Moon. Moon had been pinned beneath her, his face frozen in shock, helpless and unmoving. The long-haired woman believed they wouldn't be interrupted anytime soon. Moon closed his eyes, letting out a weary sigh. He had no idea how to fix the mess he was in. As he struggled for answers, a sudden chill swept the air, prickling his skin with a sharp, dangerous cold. His eyes snapped open. A sword of shimmering frost hovered inches from his face. Salassia stood before him, her expression a turbulent storm, her grip steady on a blade made entirely of ice magic. The frigid aura around her was suffocating. She said coldly that he should speak his last words. This was his final chance before death. Moon swallowed hard. This was bad, very bad. Slowly, he braced his hands on the ground and inched backward, forcing a shaky smile. He joked that if he said nothing, maybe he could survive. But before he could finish, the room's temperature plunged further, frost crackling along Salassia's blade. She declared icily that since he had no final words, she would finish it now. Moon's mind screamed in panic. Wrong move. He scrambled backward, waving frantically, pleading that he did have something to say. He just needed a second. Salassia didn't lower her sword. Her piercing gaze locked onto him, magic radiating lethal intent. He knew if he didn't act fast, he was finished. Desperately, he gambled on the wisdom of his past life. Taking a breath, he placed a hand over his chest and stared at her with as much sincerity as he could fake. He spoke solemnly about once having a sincere love he failed to cherish, regretting it only after losing it. Salassia narrowed her eyes but listened, the frost around her blade lingering. Encouraged, Moon continued, saying that if God gave him another chance. He didn't finish. An icy blade slashed the air, slicing strands of his hair. Moon yelped and clutched his head. Salassia demanded furiously if that was supposed to be his excuse. Moon laughed nervously, scratching his head, saying that sincerity came in many forms. Wrong answer. Salassia's fury surged. Ice crackled along her sword and fingers. She snapped that trickery wasn't sincerity. Moon flinched. Salassia's voice trembled with more than just rage. She accused that if he truly liked her, he would have faced her openly, honestly, with strength and sincerity, not through deceit. Her voice broke slightly at the end. Moon finally saw it, the trembling hands, the stiff shoulders. She was barely holding herself together. Then she looked away, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Guilt stabbed him. Moon apologized, forcing himself to confess that he never meant to offend her. He just wanted results and couldn't think of a better way. Before he could say more, Salassia slashed at him again, screaming for him to shut up and kneel. Tears streaked her furious face. Just as her blade nearly struck, a sharp knock echoed at the door, freezing the moment. Salassia tightened her grip on her sword. Moon, still kneeling, turned toward the door, torn between hope and fear. After a tense beat, Salassia shoved her sword down but replaced it with something just as dangerous. She grabbed Moon by the neck, lifting him effortlessly. She ordered coldly that he tell whoever was knocking to leave. Moon gasped, struggling under her grip, and managed to explain that the room was soundproof, only knocking could be heard outside. Salassia's eyes darkened in frustration. With a scoff, she released him, shoving him roughly to the floor. She stated icily that he would live for now, he should get dressed and open the door. Moon coughed, rubbing his sore neck, and hurried to obey, his mind racing through grim outcomes. Death by Salassia, execution by the king, or torture in some dungeon. Every option ended the same. Dead. Sighing grimly, he opened the door, bracing for Ariel's arrival. Her timing was supposed to save him according to the original plot. But the voice that greeted him wasn't hers. A polite, unfamiliar maid stood there, carrying a tray of desserts and tea. She said sweetly that the madam had noticed the long conversation and thought they might be hungry. Moon blinked, relaxing slightly. Just snacks. He awkwardly thanked her and gestured for her to enter. As the maid crossed the room, he frowned. She seemed unfamiliar, and he knew every servant in the mansion. Suspicious, he asked who she was. The maid explained smoothly that she had been assigned last night, so it was normal he didn't recognize her. Moon, still wary, casually asked if she had been hired for the banquet, noting he had heard there were no extra uniforms available. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the maid's polite smile vanished. Her green eyes snapped open, and dark magical energy erupted around her, crackling violently. The blast threw Moon backward into the door with a painful thud. Realization slammed into him. The target wasn't him, it was Salassia. The maid leapt into the air, pulling out two hidden daggers. She slashed downward with deadly speed. But a flash of icy blue light flared. Salassia's sword materialized, effortlessly blocking the twin blades. Debris scattered from the force of the clash. Moon shielded himself, pressing against the door, watching through squinted eyes. Salassia stood firm, meeting the assassin's attack without flinching. Salassia demanded coldly whether her foolish brother had sent the assassin. The maid sneered, replying that client identities were top secret. She leaned closer, smirking darkly, and declared that Salassia would die here today. Suddenly, golden magic circles flared across the walls. The assassin, triumphant, proclaimed that the third princess of the empire would die at the Duke of Campbell's mansion, announcing it as if delivering a grand finale. The magic circles transformed into dozens of blazing light swords, all aimed directly at Salassia. The radiant glow lit the room, and death closed in. The short-haired assassin sprang back just in time to dodge the devastating impact. One massive sword after another slammed into where Celestia had stood, each explosion shaking the room. She murmured to herself that there was no way Celestia had survived. Even an instructor from St. Maria College would struggle against such an assault. But then, a surge of icy air swept the room, devouring the fire. From the thinning smoke, Celestia's voice rang out, steady and commanding as she invoked ice to take form, frost to turn into a spear, and demanded supremacy. She burst forward like a freed storm, a long spear of pure ice crackling in her hands. The assassin instinctively bent backward, barely dodging the slash. Celestia stared down at her with complete detachment, unaffected by the previous attack. The assassin's eyes widened in disbelief, realizing Celestia was not only unscathed but counter-attacking. Near the door, Moon shielded his face, muttering under his breath that gods fought while mortals suffered. He tried the door handle, heart sinking when he found it locked. Another blast of magic nearly grazed him, and without thinking, he dove behind a table, determined not to become collateral damage. Peeking out cautiously, he grimaced. Assassins had never been part of the Duke's mansion events in the original novel. Then a memory surfaced. He remembered instructing Anne just last night to let unwell servants rest and recruit outsiders for the ceremony. Cold sweat ran down his spine as he realized his order had been exploited. He thought grimly that someone had to have been watching the Duke's mansion all along. A sudden explosion jolted him back to reality as an ice cone shattered, spraying deadly shards across the room. Moon yelped, huddling lower, one hand shielding himself, the other peeking out at the battle. He acknowledged bitterly that he had no magic, no combat skills, and no heroic resilience. Fighting was suicide. His best hope was for Salassia to win. But doubt gnawed at him. With the story so far off course, he no longer knew if Salassia's victory would guarantee a good ending. The assassin's voice pierced the air, calling Salassia a super genius chosen by the gods. Moon opened his eyes to see Salassia, bruised but still standing firm, her composure unbroken. Salassia stated that the assassin's attacks included sudden footwork, light arrow magic, and gravity magic, noting that two had been activated without visible magic power. She concluded sharply that another assassin was hiding in the next room. The short-haired assassin chuckled darkly, admitting Salassia's insight surpassed even the rumors. She said that even among monsters, Salassia stood apart. Unfazed, Salassia condensed her spear into a sword, its blade glowing with cold energy. She pointed it at the assassin and demanded to know who had ordered the attack, offering to spare her life in return. The assassin tilted her head slightly, amusement flashing in her green eyes. She remarked mockingly that while she shouldn't waste time, sometimes even an assassin needed to stall. Just then, the walls trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling as brilliant golden light flared against the wall. In the next room, a long-haired woman in black knelt with one hand pressed to the floor, activating a massive golden magic circle. Sweat dripped from her forehead as she shouted that she had sealed the room and urged the other to hurry. The short-haired assassin responded smoothly, palming a hidden dagger with one hand while reaching into her skirt with the other. She pulled out a small glass bottle filled with thick red liquid. An ominous black aura coiled around it like living smoke, radiating an unnatural chill. Lifting the bottle to the light, she began chanting that with the blood of 100 innocent children, she offered the sacrifice to the molten god, Lord of the Crimson Sun, the great withering king. Salassia's eyes narrowed dangerously. The moment she heard the name, a terrible unease gripped Salassia. She surged forward, her ice magic crackling to life, determined to stop the assassin. But she was a second too late. As her blade neared the assassin's neck, the glass bottle shattered. The assassin chuckled darkly as she finished the incantation, commanding the suppression of wind and snow. A storm of crimson tendrils burst from the broken bottle, swallowing Salassia's icy energy and slamming into her with brutal force. She was hurled backward, crashing into a bookshelf as an avalanche of books rained down. Glaring through the chaos, Salassia spat breathlessly that evil priests had dared to crawl into her presence. The assassin smirked, twirling her dagger lazily as she mocked that a noble princess would now die at the hands of a mouse. Salassia spotted a dagger with a red blade among the fallen books and, without hesitation, grabbed it. Gripping the weapon tightly, she met the assassin's frenzied attacks, blocking strike after strike, though fresh wounds streaked her arms and face. The assassin hesitated, her grin faltering as she noticed something wrong. Salassia, though battered, held her ground, ignoring the searing pain in her body. Without warning, the assassin lunged with a punch, which Salassia barely dodged. Scoffing, the assassin declared that without ice magic, Salassia was nothing but a lamb awaiting slaughter. A brutal kick slammed into Salassia's waist, launching her into a wooden cabinet with a violent crack. Splinters scattered, yet Salassia, bloodied and gasping, forced herself upright, gripping her arm to steady herself. The assassin sneered that it was a good look for her and said it was time to end it. She stepped forward, promising to take Salassia's head, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Her dagger drove straight for Salassia's heart. A sharp, wet sound ripped through the room. Blood splattered across the floor, but it wasn't Salassia's. The assassin's eyes widened in shock. Salassia stood frozen as Moon appeared between them, golden hair catching the dim light, blood dripping from the dagger embedded in his side. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at her, confused. He coughed violently, a mouthful of blood hitting the floor. Just moments earlier, as Moon had hidden behind the table, the door had creaked open. A low voice had whispered that their goal was only Salassia, and he was free to leave. He could have walked away. Instead, he had sprinted toward Salassia, grabbing the assassin's dagger with his bare hand, sacrificing himself to shield her. His body barely held together, but his will refused to collapse. Through blurred vision, he shouted at Salassia, demanding what she was waiting for. Snapping out of her daze, Salassia saw her opening. The assassin thrashed, screeching in fury at Moon, calling him a useless playboy. But Salassia had already moved. A flash of blue sliced through the air. Moon released the assassin's arm as Salassia's strike landed. The assassin staggered back, choking on a strangled gasp, crimson gushing from the deep wound at her throat. Salassia passed her without a word, her face unreadable. The assassin collapsed, blood pooling beneath her. Salassia exhaled softly and turned to Moon, stating that it was over. Moon lay sprawled on the cold floor, too weak to move, his breathing shallow and ragged. Salassia informed him that the second assassin had escaped. Moon could barely react, thinking bitterly how fantastic that was. Her gaze flickered toward him, suspicion mixed with something else. She asked if this assassin had been someone he hired. Moon let out a weak, wheezing chuckle, managing to deny it between gasping breaths. Salassia hesitated, then spoke again, her voice quieter. She asked why he had saved her, pointing out that if she had died, no one would have known what he had done to her. From a rational point of view, she said, her death would have been the best outcome for him. Moon whispered that it didn't matter anymore. Trembling violently, blood trickling from his mouth, he murmured brokenly, asking if he still looked like a man to her. Astalasia exhaled softly, closing her eyes for a moment. She stated that in 10 breaths, he would have no blood left, and gave him 3 sentences to say his final words, promising to pass them on to the Duke and Duchess. Moon, voice hoarse but tinged with amusement, refused. He said his curse was gone and that it was the best outcome, no words or legacy needed. Still, if he had to say something, his trembling, blood-stained hand reached up, brushing Astalasia's cheek. She stiffened, caught off guard by the gentleness. Moon whispered an apology, then confessed that he really liked her. His fingers lingered a moment longer before falling lifelessly to the ground. His breathing faded, his body going still. Astalasia stared at him, expression unreadable. After a long silence, she muttered that an apology and a life were not enough to make up for what he had done. Her body trembled slightly, emotion she refused to name boiling under the surface. She declared that she would not accept his apology. Ice formed beneath her fingertips as she poured magic into him, insisting he must live to atone for his sins. Moon blinked, his eyes open, expecting pain but feeling only warmth. He floated weightlessly in endless nothingness, his clothes gone, but it didn't seem to matter. He mused that death wasn't bad, cozy, even. Closing his eyes, he replayed his final moments, proud that he had chosen to die protecting someone as beautiful as Salassia. Not a bad way to go, he thought. Sitting up, he muttered that maybe he had made a mistake. He had a clear shot at rebirth, and he threw it away trying to be a hero. He wasn't the original Moon Campbell, the arrogant scumbag who would have walked away. With a sigh, he looked down and noticed swirling black energy forming before him. A book materialized from the mist, the prophecy book. He glared as it flipped wildly, spewing dark energy. A black mist formed into a screen, flickering incomplete words. "Keep struggling, Moon Campbell, and for the sake of this world, my..." Before he could process it, black-purple energy surged from the book. Moon shouted in frustration, demanding why it appeared only now, when it was too late. But the book gave no answer. With a final burst of light, it absorbed him completely. Meanwhile, in the sewers beneath the Duke's mansion, the long-haired assassin ran, boots splashing through murky water. Their mission had failed, ruined by Moon's interference. She cursed under her breath, furious that she hadn't eliminated him first. Intent on escaping, she sprinted through the tunnels, until a deep voice echoed around her. She skidded to a stop. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, his crimson-red aura illuminating the tunnel, suffocating the air. Behind him, a massive lion-shaped spirit blazed, red as molten fire. She instantly recognized him. Lionheart King Ron Campbell, Duke of Campbell, Moon's father. Ron stepped forward slowly, one hand resting on his sword hilt. He mused that he hadn't expected the assassin to know his name and then demanded she tell him, in detail, what she had planned for his precious son. The red lion behind him roared, shaking the tunnels. The assassin gritted her teeth, every muscle tense. She knew she wasn't facing just any opponent. She was prey now, and her hunter was Ron Campbell, a man feared across the continent. Moon lay unconscious, his breathing steady as Anne sat quietly by his bedside, watching over him. Sunlight crept across his pale face, a warm contrast to his stillness. Slowly, Moon's eyes cracked open, dazed and unfocused. Anne leaned forward, her voice filled with relief as she called to him. Blinking a few times, Moon's vision sharpened. He recognized her and murmured hoarsely that it was Anne. She nodded, leaning closer to check on him, asking if he felt any discomfort and offering to call a doctor. Moon exhaled weakly, refusing the doctor and insisting he just needed to use the restroom. He tried pushing himself upright, but a sharp pain shot through his chest. His weak muscles gave out, and he collapsed backward. Anne caught him instantly, steadying him gently and warning him to be careful. Moon chuckled awkwardly, embarrassed by his helplessness, scratching his head and apologizing. Anne reassured him that taking care of him was her duty. She then mentioned there was no need to walk, there was a chamber pot in the room, and offered to assist him. Moon blinked, baffled, as she retrieved an ornate, gold-embedded urinal, presenting it seriously. She explained that Madame had ordered her to personally handle all of his care, feeding him, giving him medicine, helping him sit up, and attending to his needs. Moon, stunned, asked if she had truly been caring for him all this time. Anne confirmed it without hesitation, saying she had even been able to tell when he was uncomfortable. Before he could process this, Anne crouched and placed her hands on his knees, asking if he needed help standing. Moon, flustered, waved his hands frantically, insisting he should manage on his own now that he was awake. Respecting his wishes, Anne bowed politely. Yet before he could react, she wrapped her arms around him and, with effortless grace, lifted him into a cradle carry. Moon stammered in protest, but Anne calmly stated this was the fastest way. Cradled helplessly, Moon could only stare, mortified. Meanwhile, down a mansion corridor, Noelle and other maids were sweeping when hurried footsteps echoed toward them. Noelle looked up, only to see Anne sprinting by, carrying Moon like a princess. Blinking in disbelief, he muttered in shock that the young master was awake. Quickly, he turned to the others, announcing he needed to inform Madame immediately. Anne stayed focused, determinedly carrying Moon toward the restroom, while Moon prayed for the floor to swallow him. Reaching their destination, Anne gently shifted him to his feet. Moon, red-faced, cleared his throat and asked if she could step outside. Anne blinked, stating that Madame had ordered round-the-clock personal protection. Moon, growing desperate, pointed out that her standing there made things difficult. Anne helpfully offered to assist him further. Panicking, Moon hastily shoved her out and slammed the door shut. Outside, Anne waited patiently, unfazed. After a while, Moon emerged, a little more composed, and Anne helped him back to bed. As he settled, a thought struck him. He asked how long he had been asleep. Anne calmly answered that he had been unconscious for 3 days. Moon's eyes widened in disbelief. Worried, he asked about his injury. Anne, setting down a tray beside him, explained as she lifted a bowl of medicinal soup. She said it had been Her Highness Celia who summoned the chief physician of the Royal Mage Corps to treat him personally. His wound was healed that same night, but due to excessive blood loss, his brain suffered temporary hypoxia, causing his prolonged unconsciousness. Moon lowered his gaze to the faint, star-like scar on his chest, a swirl of complicated emotions stirring within him. It was Celia who had saved him. He hadn't expected her to go that far. Turning slightly, he asked if Her Highness had said anything. Anne answered calmly that she had not. Moon let out a quiet breath of relief, pressing a hand against his chest. At least for now, it seemed Celia had no intention of pursuing what had happened. Just as he allowed himself to relax, Anne's expression shifted, as if recalling something. She mentioned that Celia had said something to His Majesty. Moon froze, panic flashing through him. He asked urgently what exactly Celia had said. Anne recounted how, during the investigation, it was uncovered that Celia had been the real target of the assassination, orchestrated by the underground black market operating in Bellin for years. His Majesty's fury was immediate, leading to a full-scale crackdown the next day. Many were arrested and executed. Moon leaned forward, wrapped in his blanket, listening intently. Anne continued, explaining that although Duke Campbell had captured 2 disguised assassins and extracted confessions, the fact remained. The attack happened at their mansion. They couldn't escape blame entirely. Moon clenched his fists. Normally, the Duke would have been the first to bear the consequences, but to his shock, Anne explained that the Duke had returned the next day without punishment, and later, the Campbell family was spared inspection during the aristocracy purge. She believed it was Celia who had intervened on their behalf. Moon exhaled sharply, overwhelmed with relief. He scolded Anne half-heartedly for not making things clearer sooner, claiming his heart couldn't handle that kind of scare. Anne studied him quietly, then leaned in, resting a hand on the bedboard behind him. She pointed out that he seemed unusually nervous and asked if something unspeakable had happened between him and Celia. Moon's breath hitched. Flustered, he rushed to deny it, insisting he wasn't foolish enough to touch a princess and risk execution. Anne watched him silently for a long moment before nodding and saying she understood. Without missing a beat, she scooped a spoonful of medicine from a nearby bowl and instructed him to take it. Moon, thinking the interrogation was over, obediently leaned forward. The moment the liquid touched his tongue, his eyes widened in horror. The bitterness hit like a slap. He coughed violently, accusing the concoction of being poison. Anne explained serenely that it was a tonic to replenish his blood and, noticing his disgust, added that she had even sweetened it with sugar. As she raised another spoonful, voices drifted from outside the door. The maids were whispering, remarking that the young master hated bitter things and predicting Anne might be punished for forcing him to drink it. Moon twitched violently at the gossip. When he heard Noelle suggest reporting the situation to Madame, he snapped, yelling that they weren't allowed to tell her. In a fit of desperation, he seized the bowl from Anne and chugged it in one go. The maids gasped as Noelle quietly ushered them away, deciding not to get involved. Inside, Moon sat frozen, his face twisted in agony. A moment later, he vomited violently into a nearby trash can Anne provided. Anne apologized softly, patting his back and explaining that drinking the tonic all at once was a bad idea. It was supposed to be taken slowly. Moon could only groan miserably, clutching his chest as if to reassure himself he was still alive. Setting the trash can aside calmly, Anne informed him that was only the 4th course of treatment. He would need to drink it 2 more times. Moon's face crumpled in despair, barely able to process the horror. He collapsed back onto the bed, muttering that the bitterness was worse than his life, lamenting dramatically that the world might as well end. Anne, unfazed by his theatrics, silently tidied up before returning with a small plate of pachichi cake and a pot of red tea. She poured the tea neatly and offered it, saying there was still some time before dinner and that if he needed more, he could call her or Noelle outside. Moon accepted the plate reverently, touched by the sight of Anne fussing so diligently around him. Between bites, he said softly that she had been working hard these past few days and promised to ask his mother to give her a raise. Anne curtsied politely, explaining she would report his condition to the Duke and Madame to ease their worries. With that, she excused herself and left the room quietly. Moon, cradling the pachichi cake like a precious treasure, nodded enthusiastically and praised how good it tasted, marveling at its expensive quality. As Anne reached the door, she paused to mention that the palace had sent a letter that morning, now placed in the cabinet beside his bed. She advised him to read it when he had time. Moon, still chewing, muttered thoughtfully about the palace sending him a letter, vowing to check it later. But as Anne was about to leave, he suddenly called out, asking her to wait. She stopped without turning around, asking if he had more to say. Moon, fork halfway to his mouth, confessed he had a strange question. He wondered aloud how Anne had managed to get that unbearably bitter medicine into him without any visible tubes or tools. He admitted, awkwardly scratching his cheek, that he was oddly impressed. Anne turned her head slightly, maintaining her calm composure. After a pause, she lifted one hand to her lips with quiet elegance and answered without emotion that she had put a lot of sugar in her mouth, just as he had guessed. Without another word, she briskly exited, the door clicking shut behind her. Moon blinked, replaying her words. He mumbled that it made sense, she had added sugar. Leaning back with a soft exhale, ready to nap, he let his mind drift. But then a thread of confusion tugged at him. Mouth? His eyes snapped open. Mouth? Realization hit him like a hammer. His hand flew to his lips, his face turning crimson. His thoughts spiraled wildly. Whose mouth? Hers. His. Images he couldn't control flooded his mind. Anne, calm and composed, transferring the medicine mouth to mouth. Moon howled into his pillow, mortified. Out in the hallway, Anne walked away, her face as calm and unaffected as ever, ignoring the muffled shriek behind her. Meanwhile, Moon clutched his blanket like it was a life raft, caught between horror and a strange euphoria. He muttered to himself, lamenting how he had everything, a powerful father, a beautiful mother, a handsome self, and a devoted girl like Anne, yet he still chased after Ariel. His mind drifted, softening, realizing this was still his first. Then his eyes widened. His first kiss, memories surged, Salassia, the tea, the potion, the kiss. It hadn't been a dream. His first kiss had already been stolen by Salassia. Devastated, Moon remembered the letter Anne mentioned. He rushed to the cabinet, tore open the envelope with trembling hands, and braced for the worst. Accusations, demands, punishment. But inside was a single sentence, elegantly penned on a brown letterhead trimmed with lace. I'll reluctantly consider you half a man, Salassia. Moon stared, stunned. No threats, no accusations. Just that. He pressed the letter against his chest, relief flooding him. Somehow, he had dodged disaster again. A small, helpless smile crept onto his lips. He whispered to the empty room that he had avoided the worst outcome. Later, Moon shuffled toward the dining room, moving slower than usual but determined to enjoy a meal with his parents. His peaceful entrance was immediately shattered as Noise, his mother, spotted him. With a cry, she rushed at him, wrapping him in a crushing hug, sobbing that he had scared her to death. She described the horrible sight when Ron had carried him home, bloodied and broken. Moon patted her arm awkwardly, trying to comfort her, reassuring her that he was still alive, still standing, and still charming. Eventually, Noise sniffled her way back to her seat, dabbing her eyes. But her worry reignited when she noticed the star-shaped scar visible at his loosened collar. She declared through trembling voice that her flawless son now bore a horrible scar, breaking her heart. Moon glanced at the scar and smiled gently, saying it was nothing serious, just a small weakness. Ron, steady and proud, placed a hand on Noise's shoulder and said that scars were a man's badge of honor. He added that if not for Moon risking his life to protect Her Highness, they'd be facing a far worse crisis with the king's wrath. Moon's light smile faded at that, his expression turning serious. The word assassination echoed in Moon's mind, sobering him more than any medicine. He turned to his father and asked about the incident. Ron, stabbing his steak with casual precision, explained between bites that there had been 3 assassins. One eliminated by Her Highness on the spot, another who broke through a barrier, and a third hiding in the mansion's sewers to aid in the escape. He said he had captured the last 2 and sent them to the palace. They weren't professional killers, he added, but bounty hunters from the Bellin black market, loyal to an evil god called the King of Wither. Moon frowned at the unfamiliar name, realizing it hadn't appeared in the original story. The world was filling in gaps the novel had left blank. Ron's tone grew grim as he spoke of their crimes, murders, arson, kidnappings, committed for the right price. He described their symbol. A giant eye surrounded by red flames, a fire-aligned cult. Noise chimed in brightly, assuring Moon not to worry, because his father had already led a full sweep, eradicating the black market within days. Moon, blinking in surprise, barely touched his salad as Noise, proud, reminded him that Ron had been the first Grand Duke promoted purely through military merit since the country's founding. Ron dismissed her praise with an amused smile, saying he had just been following orders, clearing out rat nests. Moon humored their conversation with a nod, saying his father was amazing, but pressed further, asking if they had discovered who hired the assassins. Ron, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, answered grimly. They hadn't. Every captured hunter had combusted instantly when trying to reveal anything, cursed to silence. Ron added that His Majesty was furious. Despite wiping out the market, they found no solid proof, meaning the real masterminds remained hidden, buried deep within the nobility. He said that the most likely suspects were high-ranking nobles, including the crown prince and a few dukes and marquises. Moon's eyes widened slightly. A conspiracy among the elite. It all felt eerily familiar. He had read this scene before, but something was off. The destruction of the Berlin black market wasn't supposed to happen yet. In the original story, it occurred 2 years later, triggered by the assassination of the king's favorite concubine. That led to the Blood River incident, a brutal purge that stained the city's sewers red for months. Without that assassination, without the Blood River, the entire chain of events leading to Ariel's transformation would unravel. Moon's mind raced as he realized Ariel wouldn't be thrown into chaos. She wouldn't become the warrior shaped by survival. Everything was already off track. He stared at his salad, appetite gone, while across the table, Ron and Noise exchanged concerned glances. They could sense something had shifted in their son, something heavy. But Moon was no longer in the room with them. His thoughts spun through rewritten futures, broken character arcs, and missing battles. The Blood River was never going to flow now, and Ariel's future was slipping away with it. Later that night, the manor lay silent, save for the soft scratch of quill against paper. In the dim glow of flickering candles, Moon hunched over a blank notebook, deliberately avoiding the harsh light of the lamp. Panic, he decided, was only useful if organized. Everyone else had urged him to rest, but rest was a luxury for people who weren't watching a story collapse. With a sigh that seemed too heavy for someone his age, Moon dipped the quill again and wrote. The story had derailed. From this point on, nothing was certain. Moon's expression hardened as he sat up straight, the candlelight sharpening the lines of his face. After a brief silence, he began to write. The plot of the original novel was useless now. Whether he survived depended solely on himself. He needed goals, simple, logical, achievable. He listed them under the flickering light. 1. Stay alive. 2. Avoid the death by 1,000 cuts ending. 3. Get stronger. 4. The black book cannot be trusted. Pausing, he placed one hand over his chest, the other tapping the quill against his lips. The fourth line didn't sit right. After a moment, he crossed it out harshly. Muttering to himself, he reasoned that just because the black book terrified him didn't mean it was lying. It was trying to help. Probably. Below the crossed out line, he scribbled a new rule. Black book prophecy must be guarded against. A compromise, uneasy but necessary. Leaning back, he stared at the notebook, thoughts spiraling. He still had no idea what triggered the catastrophe the black book warned about. No solid leads. No trustworthy allies. Only vague dreams, cryptic warnings, and the growing suspicion that either Ariel or Salassia, or both, might turn against him. Too many questions. Too few answers. Moon raked his fingers through his hair, frustration boiling over. He shouted at the ceiling, demanding a revelation. None came. Only silence. Defeated, he slumped from the desk onto the floor, sprawling gracelessly across the blanket. Eyes unfocused, arms limp, he whispered that thinking too hard wouldn't save him. Focus on what he could control. One thing was certain. Strength was survival. He had family resources, training, weapons, secrets. But none of that was enough against a group of protagonists capable of defying fate itself. The original Moon Campbell, after all, had been painfully useless. A whole year at St. Maria College of Magic, and his only reliable spell was illumination, a basic orb of light. No fireballs. No shields. Not even a simple magic hand to cheat at cards. Moon remembered it vividly. Standing in a dusty corner of the academy, dressed in his crisp uniform, extending 2 fingers with theatrical focus to conjure a glowing sphere. His 2 loyal followers had gasped in over-the-top awe, as if he had summoned a comet, not a nightlight. The memory soured his mood further. He needed real power, and fast. Moon watched the embarrassing memory play through his mind like a bad school play, then sat up and buried his face in his hands. This was beyond ridiculous, he muttered, gritting his teeth. What had this idiot version of himself even been doing in class? Sleepwalking. He raised his hand, half hoping for a spark of magical talent. Nothing. Just a hand. After a deep breath and a mental slap to stay calm, he shifted focus to his physical strength. At least there, thanks to noble blood, he wasn't completely hopeless. Late stage 1, by academy standards, enough to beat up back alley thugs, but laughable compared to real fighters. And compared to Ariel or Salassia, it was a joke. He grimaced, rubbing his temples. Salassia, bonded to an ice goddess at birth, manipulated frost like breathing. No rituals, no chanting, Just instinct, as if an invisible blue-haired deity hovered protectively behind her. Ariel wasn't much better, in fact, she was worse. She collected divine blessings like trinkets, casually stacking powers until she practically had a pantheon on speed dial. He pictured her, grinning with that massive sword, gods floating smugly behind her. Even now, when she was supposedly still a novice, she wielded rare relics and magic most would never see. If she fought someone 2 stages stronger, she'd win, and walk away with a new lesson about friendship. Moon. He'd be lucky to walk away at all. Frustrated, he shut his notebook. The conclusion was obvious. His eyes sharpened, his voice low and certain. He needed to reach a level where he could defend himself against Ariel. That was his new target. Pushing off the bed, he allowed a sly grin to form. While Ariel had divine backing, Moon wasn't completely powerless either. He remembered the assassination attempt, the fear, the blood, and more importantly, the strange power that had stirred inside him. An awakening. Not flashy, not divine, but real. He had his own cheat, and it was time to use it. Snapping his fingers with flair, he summoned it. Violet-black energy shimmered, and a circular portal opened, dropping the black book with a theatrical hum. Moon tilted his head, ready to catch it stylishly. Thwack. The book veered and smacked him directly between the legs with cruel precision. His expression froze. Then came the collapse, writhing, groaning, fetal. The book landed beside him, flipping open smugly. Moon howled in pain, accusing the book of trying to assassinate him. Clutching himself, he cursed its betrayal. The book ignored him, flipping pages indifferently as it began to glow faintly with magic. Glaring, Moon grabbed it and stopped. Dense paragraphs filled the pages, detailing recent events. His black market visit, the coming-of-age ceremony, even the encounter with Salassia, vividly detailed. Confused and a little horrified, he flipped faster. One sentence caught his eye. Later, Moon Campbell carelessly opened the door without precautions and was ambushed by an infiltrating assassin. The word, assassin, glowed red. Curious, he tapped the page. Bad idea. The red word pulsed, and blood-colored mist spilled from the book, wrapping around his arms, coiling into the air. Panicking, Moon yelped and tried to let go, but the magic sucked him in, again. As his body was dragged upward, he shouted at the ceiling that he had just recovered. Too late, he vanished. When he opened his eyes, Moon found himself standing in a dim, stone arena lit by silent torches. He muttered that this was definitely not his bedroom. A whisper sounded behind him, shadow step, and he spun just in time to see the short-haired assassin lunging toward him, dagger flashing. She slashed clean across his neck. Blood gushed. His body froze, nerves locked in terror. Everything went black. Moon jolted awake, drenched in sweat, instinctively reaching for his intact throat. Gasping, he checked his sheets for stone. Still fabric. He muttered curses under his breath. Beside him, the black book flipped pages rapidly, landing on a new section. A stat sheet. His name sat at the top, and beneath it, lists of skills and progress bars. Blinking, Moon leaned closer. This wasn't just a cursed diary, it was monitoring him, evaluating him, guiding him. A slow grin spread across his face. So that's what you really are, he murmured, running his hand affectionately over the cover. He might have insulted it earlier, but now they were partners. If he could survive a few more of these trials, preferably without getting hit between the legs, he might just carve out a cheat path of his own. Excitement buzzed in his chest. Moon chuckled softly, eyes gleaming with new fire. All right, Black Book, he whispered. Let's see how far we can push this. Late at night, under a star-scattered sky, the Duke of Campbell's mansion lay cloaked in silence. In one of its quiet rooms, Moon sprawled on his back, arms flung wide. In one hand, he held a black book. In the other, a pocket watch. He stared at the ceiling, as if expecting answers to fall from it. He said he was made it out, his voice flat, mechanical. Lifting the watch to his face, he noted the hands had barely moved. 3 seconds. That was how long he had lasted inside the Black Book's illusionary world. A grueling 3 seconds. But even that was a victory. He opened the book again, scanning his skill progression. Dagger combat, up to 1.5%. Shadow step, 1%. He chuckled. Fighting inside the book's realm was tough, but it worked. Every enemy move became a free lesson recorded in the book. No lectures, no tutors. Just pain and results. He thought of the short-haired assassin he'd faced and grinned. Her spells and speed had scared him, but soon, those techniques would be his. He tossed the book onto his face. As if on cue, the magic pulled him in again. Back in the book's world, the assassin struck instantly. A high heel crashed into his throat. Crack. No mercy. Determined, he returned, and was immediately hit with a twin strike of dark magic, collapsing in a burst of blood. Third attempt. He reappeared, filled with foolish hope. The assassin responded by calmly slicing him clean in half. As he fell, he barely managed a choked, before darkness took him again. In the real world, Anne knocked softly on Moon's door, a tray with steaming medicine balanced in her hand. When there was no reply, she stepped in quietly, whispering that it was time for his medicine. The bed looked odd, lumpy in the middle. What she couldn't know was that Moon was locked in yet another brutal battle, oblivious to everything outside. Seeing him bundled like a child made her smile. She whispered that he still slept just like he did as a boy, cheeks flushing at the thought. She set the tray on the bedside table and warmed the bowl with a gentle spell. He must have just fallen asleep, she murmured, deciding not to disturb him. She left as quietly as she came. Suddenly, the blanket shot upward. Moon bolted upright, gasping, clutching between his legs with a tortured groan. He cursed the assassin's dirty tactics. Even in an illusion, a crotch kick hurt like hell. Trembling with rage, he vowed through clenched teeth that he'd at least land one hit on her. Then, with grit and a muffled growl, he dove under the covers again. The night dragged on. The sky turned soft blue, the sun creeping above the horizon. Inside, Moon lay sprawled in bed, drained and pale. Bloodshot eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. He whispered, brokenly, that on the 185th attempt, he finally lasted 30 seconds. The realization hit like lightning. He shot upright, too fast. His legs gave out. The tray Anne had left clattered to the floor, spilling hot medicine in a steaming puddle. He collapsed beside it. Lying in a heap, he weakly pounded the floor. He cursed under his breath, but after a few minutes, the pain dulled. Sitting up with effort, he checked the book again. His shirt clung to him with sweat, and his arms shook, but his eyes were hopeful. The skill list confirmed it. Dagger combat was now 35%. Shadow step, 11%. His lips curled into a grin. He whispered that he'd succeeded. Tears pricked his eyes, but this time, they were from joy. Eager to test his new power, he cleared space on the floor. He whispered the spell, shadow step, and in a blink, he zipped across the room, leaving a ghostly blur behind. Elated, he clenched his fists and grinned wide. Then came the pain. A sharp stab through his foot. He collapsed again, writhing, groaning that it hurt. He cursed the world, wondering how the assassin ever fought like that without flinching. After several minutes of theatrical suffering, he froze. Realization dawned. He muttered that his level was too low. Shadow step required battle aura, something only second-stage warriors had. Without it, his body couldn't handle the strain. He needed a teacher. Someone to help him build real strength, not just flashy moves. Flipping through the book, he muttered that magic dominated this world. Martial artists were rare. Even if he waved around a sack of gold, finding a decent teacher would be nearly impossible. Then it hit him. He remembered the most powerful warrior from the novel, the man who stood at the peak of the world. He whispered that the man already lived under the same roof, his father. Downstairs, Duke Ron Campbell sat in his pajamas, enjoying breakfast. As he idly munched a shrimp, his gaze flicked toward the ceiling, sensing that his son was up to something. Back upstairs, Moon reminisced. Ron Campbell, Imperial Marshal by 25, Lionheart King by 32, undefeated in battle, legend of the century. And somehow, Moon had spent his life completely ignoring the mountain of treasure right under his nose. He muttered that he was pathetic, then grinned. He said there was no need for colleges or impossible to find teachers. He had the best one at home. A knock at the door. Anne's voice asked if he was awake. Surprised, Moon opened it to find her standing calmly. She said the Duke wanted to see him. His eyes lit up. Perfect timing, he said. He gently pushed Anne aside, practically glowing. He had something to discuss with his father too. Anne blinked at his odd enthusiasm but followed quietly. As they walked down the corridor, they passed Noelle and another maid. Noelle bowed awkwardly, calling out to Anne and correcting herself mid-greeting. Anne simply waved it off, saying it was fine and they should continue working. Moon raised a brow, surprised. He asked if Anne had been promoted. She replied plainly that the former headmaid resigned, and the Duke appointed her not long after Moon woke up. Moon's smile faltered. He looked away, rubbing his forehead. He muttered that it was his fault, remembering his earlier orders. His father had mentioned the old headmaid had been like family. Anne, still walking ahead, reassured him. She said it wasn't his fault, and that the former headmaid was still at the estate. He would see her later. Relieved, Moon let out a soft breath. Soon, they reached the backyard, where Noyce stood waiting. When she saw Moon, her face lit up with joy. She shouted his name and rushed forward, pulling him into a tight embrace. His face turned bright red. Noyce smiled as she pressed her cheek against Moon's and murmured that seeing him healthy again made her heart light. She reminded him, not for the first time, that calling her mother sounded too formal. She preferred mom. When he finally relented, whispering the word with hesitation, she beamed brighter than ever. Then, without warning, she guided his head down, pressing it gently against her belly. She encouraged him to squat and feel. Confused, Moon followed her lead, and after a moment, felt something, faint but real. He looked up, unsure, and asked if it was what he thought. Noyce confirmed it with a quiet laugh, saying he would soon have a little brother or sister. Moon stood quickly, excitement replacing his awkwardness. He exclaimed that it was amazing, that he was going to be a big brother. He asked if she preferred a boy or a girl, and Noyce teased that either way, he would love them just the same. She added that she had already told Ron, and said proudly that their Moon was the best. Ron sat nearby, arms crossed and smiling softly. He said nothing, simply watching the moment with rare warmth in his eyes. Moon hugged his mother again, and she stroked his hair with a calm, content expression. The quiet lingered until Ron eventually cleared his throat. He reminded them that Moon was still recovering, and the baby was delicate. No need for too much excitement. His voice was firm, but kind. He invited Moon to sit. There was something important they needed to discuss. The three of them sat at the backyard pavilion, the breeze light, the weather perfect. A butterfly drifted past as Moon took his seat. The shift in Ron's tone was immediate. His smile faded, replaced by gravity. He informed Moon that he would be returning to the battlefield that afternoon. The words landed like ice water. Moon blinked, still clinging to the glow of his mother's news. Ron explained calmly that with Moon preparing for St. Maria College next month, he would be needed at the front. He said Noyce would return to the Campbell territory to rest and prepare for childbirth. He called to Sister Faye, the composed maid standing nearby, and asked her to take care of Noyce in his absence. She placed a hand over her chest and promised she would. Moon asked if his father truly had to go. He insisted there were other generals. Why him? Ron took a sip of tea, voice steady as he explained the urgency. He said the Abyss demons were stirring again. He would be stationed at the western border for 3 years. 3 years. The number sank deep into Moon's gut. He recognized the signs. This wasn't the beginning of the war. It was the distraction. The real danger would arrive in 3 years. That was when the story truly began. He remembered the adult version of Ariel, wreathed in fire, slicing through monsters. That arc, her arc, was the turning point. And now, with Ron gone, he would miss his only chance to train under the greatest warrior alive. Moon's expression twisted into despair. He grabbed his head in both hands and stared at the sky like it had betrayed him. He thought of all his plans, his recovery, his grand return, his climb to power. All ruined. He let out a silent scream and slumped into his chair. His fingers trembled as he held his teacup. Even the liquid inside seemed unsure whether to stay put or jump out in sympathy. The day carried on without regard. The afternoon sun was warm, almost mocking in its serenity. At the estate's gate, a brown griffin sat beside a white carriage, yawning between grooming its fur. The carriage was ready. Ron stood in his full armor, red cloak lifting gently with the breeze. He held Noyce by the shoulders as she quietly cried into her hand. He told her gently that she was always a crybaby, and too much crying wasn't good for the little camel, his affectionate nickname for the unborn child. Noyce whispered through her tears that if not for the baby, she would have followed him to the border and waited until Moon's school break just to see him again. Moon, meanwhile, was crouched over, staring at the cobblestones, face twisted in silent misery. His world had just crumbled under his feet. Ron approached him and placed both hands on his shoulders. He said that Moon had proven his courage by risking his life for the princess during the assassination attempt. That alone, he said, brought honor to their family name. Moon tried to deflect, mumbling that he wasn't as great as Ron claimed. Ron disagreed. He said that being a Campbell meant more than bravery, it meant answering the call when it mattered. He gestured to the gold medal pinned to his chest and explained its meaning. The sword, the king's will, the dragon, their enemies. He called himself the Empire's blade, and said Moon would one day find his own battlefield, maybe the same one, maybe a new one, but what mattered was the kind of man he chose to be. Moon's trembling finally stopped. He looked up, affected. Ron offered a rare smile, full of belief, and told him that unlike himself, Moon would have time, allies, and resources. If there was something he wanted, now was the time. He said simply that he believed in his son. Then, without warning, Ron pulled Moon into a firm embrace. In a low voice, he said it was time to get down to business. Moon blinked, thrown off by the abrupt shift. Ron laughed, saying that everything before had been the fatherly speech. Now it was time for the real talk. He asked what Moon thought of Anne. Anne, standing at a distance, kept her usual composed posture, though her eyes flicked toward them with interest. Moon froze. He whispered that Anne was kind, capable, amazing, really, but asked why Ron was suddenly bringing her up. Ron asked if Moon liked her. Moon chuckled. He said he did like her, but not in that way. Ron said that he had known her since she was small. He praised her family, her mind, her heart. But most importantly, he said, her feelings for Moon. He tapped Moon on the forehead, saying the two had long since passed beyond servant and master. Moon flushed, the realization slowly dawning. Ron added that there was just a year left on her maid contract. If Moon liked her, he'd better act before someone else did. Moon's brain short-circuited. He stammered, asking if Ron was suggesting marriage. Ron clapped a heavy hand on his back and confirmed it. He said the real reason their family had so few children was because he and Noyce had spent too much time apart. Now, he had to leave again. Moon glanced toward his mother, gently caressing her belly, smiling to herself. The weight of legacy settled heavily on his shoulders. He weakly protested that he was already engaged to Salassia. Ron waved the concern away. He said that arrangement was political, meant to balance court factions, not a binding future. He promised that even if Salassia married into the family, she would be welcomed as the main wife, no problem. Then Ron lowered his voice into a command. He said clearly that he expected a grandchild in 3 years. Moon shrank under the pressure. Ron's presence loomed even larger, his command unmistakable. Moon tried to stutter out a refusal, but Ron silenced him with a firm grip and a steely gaze. This, he said, was the master's command. As the sun dipped low, casting the estate in gold, the household gathered for farewell. Ron and Noyce boarded the carriage, the griffin stirred, and the door shut with a final click. Moon and Anne stood at the gates, watching the vehicle shrink into the horizon. The steady rhythm of hooves faded into the wind. Anne turned slightly, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. She said that she had heard Moon mention her name while speaking with the Duke. She asked if there was something he needed. Moon, hands in his pockets, eyes squinting toward the sunset, turned to her. His expression was caught between resignation and disbelief. He said it wasn't a secret anymore. His father wanted her to marry him, and also hoped they'd have children, for the strength of the Campbell line and all that. He laughed awkwardly and added that, of course, it was just a joke. She didn't have to take it seriously. Anne didn't speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She simply stared at Moon, frozen. He stepped closer and gently rested a hand on her shoulder, bathed in the fading glow of the sun. His voice was soft, sincere. He said that being a maid was just her current role, not her worth. One day, they'd each follow their own path. He added that she deserved better than someone like him. Her face didn't change much, but a subtle shift in her brows betrayed something stirring beneath the surface. He continued, saying that if she ever loved someone else, she should tell him. He'd release her himself, with the finest dowry in the Empire. He patted her shoulder and smiled, claiming that anyone leaving the Campbell family should walk away with pride. With that, he turned and walked toward the mansion, satisfied. The golden sunlight traced his back as he walked. Internally, he cheered. He whispered to himself that he'd nailed it. declaring he was undeniably cool. He even did a small celebratory shuffle out of sight. But Anne didn't move. Her hands trembled at her sides, her face masked in shadow. She stood still, silent, but not calm. Her fingers clenched so hard they drew blood, drops falling unnoticed. Her voice, cold and quiet, repeated his words, "Let me go." Her eyes narrowed, no warmth in them now, only something sharp and dangerous. She murmured that he really had changed. Darkness churned around her as she declared that she can't wait anymore, it has to be tonight. By nightfall, the estate sat in stillness beneath a quiet drizzle. Inside the Campbell library, torchlight danced between towering bookshelves. Moon hunched over a desk, muttering as he flipped pages, surrounded by scattered volumes. He muttered that plans never survived change, and today had proved it. His father's sudden departure, the surprise talk of marriage, and the collapse of his self-improvement plan all hit like a storm. Still, if nothing else, he was adaptable. If he couldn't train under his father, he'd self-study. If assassins came for him, he'd hit back harder. He scanned titles like Vital Strike Techniques and Imperial Soldier Conditioning, flipping through them with practiced efficiency. Then he summoned the black book. It hovered above his desk, pulsing faintly. His expression sharpened as he grabbed it, muttering that it was time to see what it could really do. The pages fluttered open, glowing faintly, then stopped on a list of copied texts. Everything he'd read today was already recorded. His lips curled into a grin. The book's recording function was flawless. He cradled it in both hands, gazing at it with exaggerated affection, calling it brilliant and declaring his love for it. With mock-serious drama, he kissed the cover. A knock interrupted him. He jumped and fumbled to hide the book. The door creaked open and Anne entered, calm as ever, carrying a tray. She asked if he was still reading. He stood awkwardly, startled. Then he noticed the tray and asked if it was a snack. Anne confirmed it and guided him to a cozy rest area near the shelves. She set down the tray, poured a drink, and presented it with quiet pride. She explained that the wine was a rare vintage from Count Locke's vineyard, only 100 bottles made annually, selling for 200,000 ame. Moon raised an eyebrow at the absurd price. He sampled the cake instead, letting the sweetness ease his tension. He waved off the wine, saying it would knock him out before he could finish studying. Her smile didn't falter, but under her fingers, the wine bottle cracked. Glass creaked softly as pressure built around her grip. Still, she remained poised and set the bottle aside. With the same practiced calm, she asked what he'd prefer to drink. He said coffee would help him stay awake. She sighed quietly and instead lifted the teapot, pouring tea into a porcelain cup. She apologized, explaining that the coffee had been ruined, not opened by rats, she said, due to a careless maid. She noted that fresh beans were ordered, but not yet delivered, and suggested he wouldn't want rodent-tainted coffee anyway. Moon's eyebrow twitched. The oddly specific excuse made something stir in the back of his mind. He studied her carefully. Anne, unfazed, continued as if nothing were wrong. He sighed, resigned. Black tea would do. He took the cup, inhaled the aroma, and sipped. Something was wrong. His fingers trembled. The cup dropped from his hands, shattering. Tea spilled like red ink across the floor. A wave of nausea overtook him. His body failed. His knees buckled. Anne caught him smoothly, cradling him with eerie gentleness. Her face betrayed nothing but serene concern. Moon croaked her name, barely audible. He asked if she had betrayed him. She brushed his hair back and murmured close to his ear that she would never betray him. Never. Darkness swallowed him. Her whisper followed. She said it hurt now. That she had loved him deeply. That his words earlier had cut her. She said she must purify him with her love. That they would always be together, until the end of the world. Moon's eyes snapped open, lungs gasping. Sweat clung to his skin. The voice still echoed in his mind, unmistakable. He looked around. Darkness. No walls, no ceiling. Only black. His wrists and ankles were shackled to a wooden frame, iron biting into his skin. He struggled, but it was no use. He recognized this. He had seen it before, in the black book. A prophecy, a warning. He whispered in disbelief. This place, this moment, it wasn't supposed to be real. From the shadows, Anne emerged, sitting on top of him with disheveled clothes. Her smile, small, pleasant, and far too calm, sent a spike of dread through him. The maid he knew was gone. Something else stood in her place. Moon's heart pounded. He asked what she was doing. As she continues doing, you know what she says, that it's as he sees. She continued saying that 10 years ago when he was 8, she came to his side. From that moment on she existed only for him and belonged only to him. In return he must also only belong to her. What she's doing, she claims she is merely putting the young master back on the right path. He shouts in panic, asking what path is she talking about. He begged her to let him go first and talk it out. She pressed 2 fingers on his lips and replied that it's too late, he doesn't need to do anything and can just leave everything to her. Then she declares madly that after tonight, his everything will belong to her. And then, she continued for God knows how long. When she finally finished, he looked like a man who had been through war. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. He thought that he didn't even remember how many times she did it. After a certain point his consciousness started to fade. He never imagined that his 30-year career as a virgin would end like this. And what he expected even less is the culprit who pushed the original Moon to become a human scum and eventually imprison him and then cut him into pieces would be Anne. He recalled their earlier battle where she continued even when it hurt. He told her that she could stop and unshackle him, but she refused, saying that compared to the long 10 years of waiting, this bit of pain is nothing. She confessed that all these years she doted and pampered him. She made him arrogant, conceited and ignorant. She turned him into a useless scum that everyone fears, detests and avoids. All, in order to make him hers and hers alone. She worked hard for 10 years, so no matter what he says, she won't let him go tonight. Back to the present, Moon could only sigh at his fate. Who could have guessed that she'd not only be a super yandere but also the reason he became a scumbag? Still, he admits to himself that yesterday felt good, but the problem is that according to the prophecy, he will eventually die at her hand. He had managed to avoid the exile path, so he needs to find a way out of this mess. Across the bed, she stared at him asking what he's doing. He replied that his hands were itchy. She started preparing to leave, saying she must go to avoid suspension. Then, as if coming to realization, she said that since he already belonged to her, why doesn't she just get rid of everyone in the castle? Startled, Moon told her not to do that. Anne was just about to leave, but his hoarse voice stopped her. With slow, measured steps, Anne returned to Moon, her expression forming a sweet but unsettling smile. She asked playfully if he had another favorite maid, perhaps Noelle. The question landed like a slap. Moon flinched, mumbling a nervous denial while avoiding her gaze. Anne laughed softly, covering her mouth as if trying to keep it polite. Her eyes sparkled with amusement. She told him she was only joking, no need to look like a frightened animal. But then, her tone shifted, calm and direct. She said as long as he behaved, there would be no need to involve anyone else at the Duke's mansion. Unless, of course, it became necessary. Moon stiffened at the threat. He asked if she could release him. Anne agreed sweetly and snapped her fingers. A soft glow shimmered in the air as the shackles clicked open and dropped from his limbs. But she added a warning. Don't do anything reckless. The room was sealed, designed by her, with a custom forged door and a single key, hers. Moon sat up, rubbing his wrists, discomfort growing. Freedom didn't mean much inside a cage. He pointed out that if he vanished, people would notice. Anne reassured him with a smile. She had already told the staff he returned to college early, saying he missed it too much. As she turned to leave, she added softly that he should rest. Obediently, Moon called out after her, but the heavy door closed with a steel thud. The lock clicked with finality. Alone, he ran a hand through his hair and groaned. This was bad. He muttered to himself that of all the people the Black Book's prophecy could have pointed to, of course, it had to be Anne. Now he was trapped. He stood and glared at the door, declaring he wouldn't live out his days as a prisoner. Freedom was non-negotiable. With a determined yell, he rushed the door. It didn't budge. He collapsed in pain, clutching his shoulder, groaning dramatically before lying still, defeated. He admitted, yes, the craftsmanship was impressive. Just as despair set in, something stirred beside him. A familiar dark glow. The Black Book. Moon groaned. Not now. He muttered that Anne was on another level, maybe even rivaling Salassia. Even with training, he wouldn't beat her. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the book and flipped through the pages. Then he stopped. One page stood out. An equation, something from the night before. It wasn't just a technique. It was a formula, a strategy, a way to win. His lips curled into a grin. He said he was ready. He started training. 198, 199. His voice echoed in the quiet, his palms pushing against the cold floor. At 200, he collapsed, gasping. Sweat streaked down his chest, his breath ragged. He raised one hand, whispering that at least his body was still holding together. Skills were the book's domain. Strength, though, that was earned. He clenched a fist. He was done being stepped on. A single tear slid down his cheek. He vowed to rise. A voice responded from behind the door, Anne's. She said she was relieved to see him so spirited. The door creaked open. Anne entered, floating dishes in a steaming metal tub in soft magical light. She remarked, amused, that he sounded like a husband welcoming his wife. The bathwater was perfectly heated, the food still warm. Moon lit up. He hadn't bathed in 2 days. Before she could finish, he dropped his sheet and jumped into the tub, splashing water onto the floor. Anne blinked, then said softly that bath time had clearly taken priority. He rinsed his hair, then called to her, saying he could handle things himself. He wasn't a child. Anne nodded, smiling faintly. Understood. She lifted a silver lid to reveal a steaming plate of meat and vegetables. Holding a fork, she approached. If he wouldn't let her wash him, she joked, at least let her feed him. Moon hesitated, but she made no move to hurt him, so he relaxed and agreed. Anne fed him carefully, catching any dripping sauce with her hand. She asked him to say, "Ah," and he did. The meat melted in his mouth. His eyes widened in surprise. It was rich, tender, and perfectly seasoned. He grabbed the plate and fork and began eating hungrily, even as splashes from the tub landed on the dish. He said it was better than anything he'd had, even when his parents were home. Anne watched with quiet satisfaction and confirmed it was beef. She explained that he'd eaten it before, though usually she turned it into soup. Curious, Moon asked which cut it was, tenderloin or shoulder. Anne replied it was a special cut. The rod from the Magratha giant bull. Moon paused. Anne elaborated. The bull's member was incredibly energetic, making the meat extra nutritious. The fork dropped into the water. His face paled. He imagined some monstrous glowing bull and gagged, leaning over the tub. Anne calmly placed a bin beside him. She added that other rare ingredients had been used too: tiger rod, goblin shaft, troll meat. Dragon rod would have been ideal, if not so rare. Moon waved frantically, still coughing. He asked why anyone would cook with that. Anne answered plainly that she had been feeding him those for some time. They'd helped his strength improve. Moon stared at her in disbelief, pointing with a trembling hand. He shouted that it wasn't normal. He demanded to be let out. But before he could finish, his body slumped. His arms dropped. His words faded. Anne murmured to herself that one drop was enough. As Moon lost consciousness, she caught him gently, cradling him in her arms. She whispered that he was right. It hurt to be trapped. But if freeing him meant losing him, she couldn't allow that. She told him to sleep and let her handle everything. Her expression softened. She brushed his damp hair, her face pressed gently to his. Outside, the moon cast pale light over the Duke's estate. Peaceful, silent. Time passed. Moon stirred awake, blinking against the low light. His head throbbed faintly. He wasn't in the tub anymore. He lay in a bed, wrapped in blankets. Anne stepped forward, putting her clothes back on after gobbling some meat of her own, and asked if he felt unwell. He didn't reply. He turned away and stared at the wall, his silence heavy and deliberate. Anne crouched beside the bed, her tone light. She asked if he was still angry. Moon didn't answer, just frowned, face tight with quiet resentment. Anne paused, then offered a small concession. She said that since the young master had been cooperative lately, she would allow one small request. Moon's eyes flicked toward her with sudden interest. A request. He didn't hesitate. He asked for freedom. Anne denied it instantly. He asked for clothes, but she denied this as well. Moon sighed, frustrated. Anne tapped her lips thoughtfully and suggested something more manageable. Perhaps he could choose his meals. Moon perked up. He asked if she really meant it. She smiled and confirmed. It was small, but still something. Encouraged, she leaned in and asked if he already had something in mind. Moon didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, coughed gently, and changed the subject, asking if autumn was near. Anne, puzzled, nodded. Moon went on, reminiscing about autumn's past, how he'd ride a boat on Beaver Lake, sipping Count Locke's wine and eating freshly caught fish while surrounded by red and gold maple trees. In his mind, the lake shimmered, still and endless, a floating mirror for the season's fire-colored leaves. Anne hesitated before asking gently if he wanted fish from Beaver Lake. He nodded. She started to protest. The lake was far, and delivery would be difficult. But then she heard it. Moon's soft sobbing. Startled, she turned to see him clutching his chest with one hand, the other raised dramatically as if performing a tragedy. He said that only last year he'd been like nobility, drifting on calm waters, and now he was trapped in a tiny room, abandoned by the world. He declared it unjust, unbearable. He flopped over, pulled a blanket over his head, and continued wailing that he couldn't even eat Beaver Lake fish anymore. What was the point of life? Anne hesitated, face softening with guilt. She took a step forward, unsure. But behind the blanket, Moon grinned. He wasn't crying anymore. Anne exhaled and closed her eyes. She said she understood. The second she spoke, Moon shot up, eyes gleaming, hands clasped in joy. He asked if she really meant it. She blinked at his sudden recovery, then nodded. Yes, she would get the fish. No matter what. Moon leaned back, tossed her a dramatic imaginary kiss, and told her she was the most dependable maid in the entire house. He would wait patiently. She shouldn't let him down. Anne froze, hand rising to her mouth, cheeks flushed red. Her heart raced. She stepped forward suddenly and gently touched his shoulder. Moon blinked, confused. Without a word, Anne closed her eyes and gave him a brief kiss on the lips, soft, warm, and fleeting. Moon froze, stunned. Anne turned away silently, walking toward the door. At the threshold, she said calmly that Beaver Lake was far, but she'd be back by noon tomorrow. She asked him to wait. Moon replied weakly, still dazed. Okay. Anne nodded once, opened the door, and stepped out, closing it gently behind her. Outside, her pace was quick, her face hidden beneath her bangs. She lowered her head, breath unsteady, cheeks blazing. She thought she'd lost control. The young master was just too much. Trying to hide a small nosebleed, she wiped it away with her sleeve and told herself she had to hurry. The fish came first, and after that, more reasons to make him smile. Back in the room, Moon exhaled in relief. She was gone. One more day of chaos survived. His expression shifted. He raised his left hand, summoning a swirl of dark energy. The black book appeared in his palm, pulsing faintly. With Anne gone, he finally had time to execute his real plan. He asked the book if it could generate training realms beyond the assassin simulation. The book responded with a subtle float, a yes. Perfect, Moon said. He instructed it to recreate the training method from a book he'd read earlier, A Realm of 1,000 Locks. He wanted to master that technique before Anne returned. The black book opened, flipping through its pages. A burst of energy engulfed Moon. He sat cross-legged, eyes closed, fists clenched. This time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Far away, at Beaver Lake, the weather had turned violent. The sky was dark, thunder rolled like cannon fire, and rain fell in relentless torrents. Trees swayed and bent under howling winds. The once calm lake was now a storm-tossed basin of churning waves. Anne, cloaked and masked, pressed forward through the chaos. No storm would stop her. A forest ranger, soaked and panicked, called out to her. He warned her the area was restricted, that it was too dangerous to go further. She asked why. He hesitated, tried to lead her away gently. She stepped back, and in a flash, metal spikes erupted from the ground, cutting the ranger's hands. He yelped in pain. She warned him not to touch her. Her voice was steady and cold. She demanded answers. The ranger, shaken, finally spoke. He explained that the Lake Master, a high-tier magical creature, had awakened. The Adventurers Association had dispatched a B-ranked party. The area was under lockdown. Anne listened without emotion. She glanced at the sky, letting the rain hit her open palm. So the storm, she murmured, was part of the creature's power. The ranger, frightened, offered a bribe to make her leave. She tossed a small pouch of coins at his feet instead. She told him it wasn't necessary. He stared at her in disbelief. Even knowing the danger, she was going through with it. He asked why. But she didn't answer. She turned away, the storm rising behind her. She braced herself, clutching her hat as the wind tried to tear it from her head. Her hair whipped around her face. She walked into the storm, smiling faintly, her ruby eyes burning, not with fear, but purpose. She had a promise to keep. And she always kept her promises. The storm raged on. At the rear of the storm-battered group stood a girl in a red cloak, soaked to the bone but unmoved by the cold. Aluca's grip on her wand was tight, her gaze fixed on the battlefield. She wasn't here just for the mission, her thoughts were on someone else. She told herself that if this kept up, he might be taken away, and she wouldn't allow that. She decided that once this was over, she'd finally confess how she felt. The thought made her blush, even in the freezing rain. A dreamy smile tugged at her lips, brief, until a voice snapped her back to reality. Someone called out to her. She flinched and apologized quickly, returning her attention to the fight. Up front, two teammates were already engaged. Rod, clad in armor, was bracing against the rising lake water with his shield. Beside him, Tia, in a purple cloak, was casting defensive spells, eyes scanning for threats. Rod shouted that he needed healing. Aluca nodded, chanted, and raised her hand. A glowing green circle formed, casting warmth through the mist. Healing energy flowed toward Rod and Tia, just in time. But then everything changed. Tia whispered that something was coming. Rod tensed. The lake exploded upward in a towering column of water, and from its heart emerged a monstrous fish, massive and grotesque. Its red eyes gleamed, and its gaping mouth revealed row upon row of fangs. The team instantly fell into formation. As the creature inhaled, water gathered into a giant orb at its jaws. Tia shouted to Rod, and he snapped out of it, casting a golden shield around them just as the orb launched. The watery explosion smashed into the barrier. It held, barely. Rod stood firm, legs braced, teeth clenched. He shouted that now was their chance, attack with magic. Aluca hesitated, stunned by the sheer size of the beast, but Rod's voice grounded her. She chanted, summoning frost. A blue glow wrapped around her as mist began to gather. Before her spell could land, though, a blast of fire whistled past her. Tia had already launched her own spell, intense flames straight into the creature's mouth. It exploded from within, roaring in agony as its body ignited. Rod seized the moment, charged, and leapt. Sword raised, shield slung behind him, he struck with full force. The blade cracked through the monster's skull. Fire burst again, and the creature collapsed into the lake, defeated. Waves surged to the shore. Rod landed, winded, using his sword as support. Mud streaked his face, blood dripped from his forehead, but he smiled and gave a thumbs up. He said it was over, and thanked Tia. Tia blushed, brushing hair from her face, asking if he was hurt. Rod laughed it off, but she spotted a wound and gently healed it, scolding him for underplaying it. Aluca watched them, frozen. Her wand lowered, her spell unused. Rod's words echoed. Tia, you're so kind. I'm lucky to have you. Each syllable chipped away at her resolve. She remembered when she and Rod had made promises under summer skies, dreaming of becoming heroes. She had never stopped holding onto that dream. But now, watching Rod and Tia together, it felt like she'd already been left behind. Rod finally turned and called out to her, telling her to help with the cleanup. Aluca forced a smile, said she was coming. Her hat fell. She didn't bother picking it up. Then, just as she stepped forward, a low, unnatural hum broke through the rain. Her entire body froze. Rod and Tia heard it too. The lake's surface began to spin, forming a vortex. Wind howled, trees bent, clothes whipped violently. The air charged with pressure as a towering water column rose again. From it, the real lake master emerged. This creature dwarfed the previous one. Its pitch-black scales were scarred from ancient battles. A glowing crimson horn protruded from its head. Its red eyes scanned the shoreline like a predator picking targets. Tia acted quickly, casting another fire spell. It struck the beast, and vanished on contact. Useless. The monster roared. Its horn crackled with red lightning, and in an instant, bolts ripped through the air. Rod and Tia were blasted backward. Tia screamed as lightning scorched her side. Rod's armor sparked violently. Before he hit the ground, Aluca dove and caught him, skidding across the muddy ground. Rod, barely conscious, whispered that they couldn't win. He told her to run. But Aluca hesitated, eyes drifting to Tia's fallen form. Rod tried to stand, jamming his sword into the dirt. Blood dripped from his face, but he didn't falter. He said he wouldn't let her die here, even if it cost him everything. Aluca's heart cracked. The fire inside her dimmed. Before she could speak, Rod staggered toward Tia. From the trees above, a new presence watched. A girl cloaked in black stood calmly on a branch, blade twirling lazily in her hand. She studied the lake master with unsettling calm. She whispered that this was a monarch-class creature. Interesting. The lake master roared again, preparing a massive attack. Crimson lightning swirled at its horn's tip, building into a colossal orb. Rod reached Tia just as the attack launched. He held her tight, bracing himself. He had no defense left. But before it hit, a golden beam split the sky. The lake exploded in light. The ground shook. The world turned white. When the light faded, Rod opened his eyes. No pain, no impact. A massive black wall stood behind him, lined with red lightning. The attack had been stopped cold. He stared in disbelief. Aluca, too, was stunned. She fell backward, eyes wide. Had someone actually heard it? A calm voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned and saw the cloaked girl now standing in front of her. Aluca stammered, asking who she was. The woman didn't answer. She simply slung her weapon behind her, lifted a hand, and began casting. She said she was glad Aluca was safe, but now it was her turn to end this. The spell, imprisonment, asterisk, metallic energy swirled in the air. It twisted and reformed into black molten iron. With a flick, it shot toward the lake master. In midair, it morphed into jagged spikes and pierced the creature's body one after another. The lake master screamed, thrashing violently as more spikes drove in. The ground shook beneath its rage. And for the first time, the creature looked afraid. The woman wasn't finished. With a sweep of her hand, she shaped the molten iron into a spiraling staircase that reached toward the lake master's towering form. Each step she took echoed with quiet, deliberate intent. She muttered under her breath that all this noise had scared off the fish she meant to bring back for the young master. At the summit, she raised her black scythe. Magic surged into the blade, expanding it with a menacing glow. Her voice dropped into a whisper, calm, cutting, that for such a sin, the beast would pay with its life. Her eyes snapped open, cold, unwavering. She brought the scythe down in a single, brutal arc. A roar tore through the sky as the monster was split clean in two. Blood exploded outward in a violent cascade as the halves crashed into the lake with a thunderous splash. Water surged, trees trembled, and mist soaked the hills. Even Rod and Tia, far from the center, were drenched. A fish landed on Rod's head and flopped once before sliding off. Rod, stunned, simply stared at the ruined lake. That was the lake master. And it was gone, just like that. Aluca came running toward him, voice laced with concern. Rod reassured her that he was okay, but Tia, unconscious and pale, wasn't. Her bruises had worsened. Rod held her close, pulled a healing potion from his pouch, and began treating her. Then, turning to Aluca, he asked for a favor. He wanted her to find out who that woman was, the one who just soloed a dominant level beast with a single blow. If she wasn't part of a guild, he wanted her on their team. Meanwhile, Anne crouched near a puddle, holding two flopping fish and frowning. She couldn't remember which ones were edible. She quietly scolded herself for forgetting something so basic. What kind of maid forgets the fish her master likes? Behind her, a gentle voice chimed in. A girl approached, kneeling beside her and pointing out that both fish Anne held were inedible, the red one too tough, the colorful one toxic. But the pair nearby, perfect. Anne raised a brow, surprised by her knowledge. The girl nodded, saying her village was across the lake. Every autumn, they fished here for nobles who paid well for Beaver Lake's famed catch. Anne stood and asked if the girl would teach her how to prepare the fish. Grilling or steaming, the girl explained, worked best. Just salt, ginger, and a splash of wine to cut the smell. Anne scribbled it all down in a notebook, thanking her sincerely. The girl blushed and said it was nothing. Anne had just saved everyone, after all. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she asked a quiet question. Had Anne come all this way, just to catch fish for someone? Anne answered without pause. Yes. The young master wanted fish from this lake, and she was going to deliver. The girl smiled, touched by the gesture. Anne gathered the fresh fish, nodded politely, and said she would return home now, but as she turned, the girl called out hesitantly. She said she had a small question. About love. Anne stopped and turned. The girl's cheeks turned crimson as she asked if someone like Anne could answer something personal. Anne, calm as ever, said she would try. Emotions had no perfect answers, but she'd help if she could. The girl said it was about a friend. Someone who had liked a boy for years, but never confessed. He was kind to everyone, so she couldn't tell if he saw her differently. And now, another girl had appeared. Closer to him. Her friend didn't know if she should give up. Anne listened, then asked simply, how much did she love him? The girl tried to deflect, but then gave in. It was her. She admitted she'd loved him since they were kids. Over 10 years. Anne asked if she would give her life for him. Without hesitation, the girl answered yes. She'd do anything, even things others wouldn't understand. Anne nodded. Then, she said, the answer was already there. If her feelings ran that deep, she didn't need anyone's permission to act on them. Still uncertain, the girl, Aluca, asked what that meant. Anne didn't elaborate. She raised her hand, lifting the bucket with a simple spell. It floated behind her as she turned to go. She left Aluca with one last piece of advice: follow your truest feelings. If you choose to love, then love completely. Make no choices you'll regret. Good luck, Miss Aluca, she said softly. Then she walked away, and continued along the path. Behind her, Aluca stood still, eyes locked on her fading silhouette. She whispered Anne's final words to herself. Give everything for the one I love. Follow my innermost thoughts. Asterisk. No exact answer had been given. But her heart, confused as it was, had been moved. She wondered, could she really confess to Rod? Was she ready? Then something stirred inside her. A flicker of warmth, red and black, ignited in her chest. Her eyes widened as it swirled, growing stronger. She dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, trembling. A faint flame rose briefly along her skin. A voice echoed in her mind. Soft, insistent. It asked if she was truly giving up. If she, who would give anything for him, would just stand by and watch. She gasped, unable to answer. The heat clouded her thoughts. The voice continued, pressing her. Will you let them be together? Asterisk. Rod, not far away, turned, concern in his voice as he saw her falter. He reached out. Tia stirred beside him, hand over her chest, sensing something but not knowing what. Neither of them saw the flicker of light wrapping around Aluca. And neither heard the voice still whispering inside her. The voice in Aluca's mind persisted, coaxing her deeper. It asked if she really wanted Rod to end up with someone else, especially her, the girl in his arms. Aluca's breath hitched as tears streamed freely. She clenched her shirt, whispered through her teeth that she didn't want to lose him, not to anyone. Her eyes shimmered red, the flame inside her growing. A small flickering spirit, warm and glowing, appeared beside her. Its voice was gentle but insistent. It told her she finally understood. Now was the time. Go, claim what was hers. Make sure no one took him away. Fueled by pain and desire, Aluca stood. The fire gave her strength. She hesitated, murmuring that Rod was strong. The flame responded that even the strongest had weaknesses, and it would lend her power. A flare burst across her chest. Not painful, intoxicating. A red eye surrounded by flame etched itself into her skin, pulsing faintly. She quickly hid the mark under her cloak. Rod noticed her rise and asked if she was all right, if the mysterious woman had done anything to her. Aluca gave a soft, overly calm smile. She said the woman, Miss Anne, had done nothing, she was just drained. And no, she wouldn't join their team, she was from a noble family. Rod looked disappointed, muttering that he'd hoped to thank her properly. Without her, they wouldn't have made it. Tia stirred and glanced at Aluca's chest, spotting the faint glow beneath her collar. She asked if she was hurt. Aluca pulled her cloak tight, brushing it off as residual magic from the lake. She chuckled, then shifted the subject quickly, said they should head back. It wasn't safe here, and Tia needed healing. Rod didn't question it. He lifted Tia into his arms. Tia protested weakly, saying she could walk. Rod smiled and said she was light enough to carry forever. Tia blushed and tapped his chest, calling him a dummy. They bickered, warm and familiar. Behind them, Aluca's expression hardened. Watching the ease between them, something inside her stirred again. Her aura shimmered faintly red. The fire wasn't gone, it had only just begun. By the next day, Anne had returned to the Duke of Campbell's mansion. The storm had passed. Sunshine blanketed the estate. In the basement she had meticulously prepared, Moon stirred awake, groggy from oversleeping. The heavy iron door clicked open. Anne entered, back in her maid uniform, carrying a tray under a silver lid. She smiled and announced her return. Moon sat up dramatically, waving his arms and pretending he was on the verge of starvation. Anne laughed, brushing his cheek as she teased him. Was he finally so moved that he was ready to give her his heart? Moon flinched, muttering that he just didn't want to die of hunger. Anne sat beside him, placing the tray on her lap. She apologized for the delay. Beaver Lake was far, but she rushed to bring back fresh fish. She lifted the lid to reveal two beautifully prepared dishes, one grilled, one steamed, both garnished and aromatic. Moon's eyes lit up, stunned by how good it smelled. Anne offered him a choice. He picked the steamed one. She scooped a bite and brought it to his lips. Moon opened his mouth obediently, took the bite, and lit up. He exclaimed that it was incredible, then offered her a taste. She declined with a smile, reminding him the fish was for him alone and warning about small bones. He brushed it off, then froze mid-bite. Something scratched his throat. His hand shot to his neck. A bone. Anne, entirely calm, remarked that there was only one solution. Moon tensed. She set the tray aside and leaned in. He asked what she was doing, voice rising with panic. She said she'd kiss the bone out. Her lung capacity, she added, was quite impressive. Moon protested, eyes wide, but Anne pressed forward. Her lips met his. It wasn't romantic, it was efficient. But Moon, clearly overwhelmed, trembled all the same. Then it was over. Anne leaned back, panting slightly, and playfully stuck out her tongue. The tiny fishbone sat neatly on its tip. She teased that she just couldn't help herself after being gone so long. Moon, blushing furiously, turned away and muttered a quiet thanks, demanding the plate so he could finish the rest himself. He devoured it like a starved squirrel, cheeks puffed with each bite. Anne watched, smiling softly. When the food was gone, Moon flopped back onto the bed, groaning with satisfaction. He mumbled that now he understood why the Empire worshipped this dish. Anne cleared the tray and fishbones, but her tone grew more serious. She reminded him of their duty, securing the future of the Campbell line. Moon froze. His eyes widened. He scrambled backward on the bed, insisting it wasn't a good time. Anne tilted her head, asking if he was rejecting her. He quickly explained it was just bad timing. They'd just eaten, and overexertion after a meal was unhealthy. Plus, she had just returned from a long journey. Anne blinked, then placed her hands over her mouth, touched. She asked gently if he was worried about her health. He nodded awkwardly. Sure, let's say that. Composing herself, Anne said she had something to report. On her way back, she passed through a city renowned for royal tailoring. Moon nodded, curious. Anne leaned close, voice dropping to a whisper. She bought something, tailored in his favorite glossy black silk, a bodysuit. And a matching accessory, currently a hit in underground maid dance clubs. They called it the bunny girl outfit. Moon's nose bled almost instantly. He turned away, wiping it off, stammering that he was a proper gentleman. Anne gave a soft laugh, her voice playful as she reminded Moon that she had served him for years, and had definitely seen his secret bookshelf. Moon groaned and buried his face in his hands, surrendering with a sigh. He raised a thumb in defeat, admitting that yes, he loved black stockings. Anne didn't tease him further. Instead, she covered her mouth with a delicate hand and chuckled softly, saying it was adorable to see him finally being honest. Gracefully, she turned toward the table, using a faint pink glow of magic to lift the empty plate beside her. As it floated to her side, she stepped toward the heavy door. Before leaving, she glanced back with a warm smile and said she would be tending to the internal affairs of the mansion, but they'd see each other tonight. Moon waved her off, mumbling that he was going to nap. The door shut with a solid clank, and her footsteps faded. The basement was quiet again. But Moon wasn't resting. He sat up slowly and rolled his tongue inside his mouth. One by one, he spit out several intact fishbones onto his palm. These weren't food scraps. They were tools. He whispered that he had the goods, grinning with purpose. According to the Black Book, it was just past 3 in the afternoon. Anne likely wouldn't return until 6. 3 hours to escape. One shot. He selected the longest fishbone and crouched at the door. This wasn't conventional, but he had trained for this. Deep breath, steady hands. He inserted the tip of the bone into the lock. Activating his skill, his eyes went jet black, glowing faintly. His senses shifted. The world warped. Suddenly, he stood inside the lock's inner realm, cold, misty, and alien. 12 massive silver cylinders floated midair, each one swaying with the rhythm of a hidden mechanism. Moon muttered in disbelief. 12 core locks. Any mistake, and the whole system would reset or destroy his fishbone. The pressure snapped him out of focus. The illusion shattered, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping. He lay there, staring at the ceiling. That lock wasn't designed to keep intruders out. It was made to trap someone in. He sat up, strategizing. He had 4 usable fishbones. That was it. No extras, no margin for error. Worst of all, if Anne found any trace of tampering, she'd reinforce security. This wasn't just an attempt, it was his only chance. He tried again. Crouched in front of the door, Moon held the lock steady with one hand, guiding the fishbone with the other. He worked slowly, carefully testing each cylinder. Then, snap. He froze. The fishbone broke. 3 locks remained. He dropped to the floor in despair, groaning dramatically. He cursed the lock, rolling around like an emotionally exhausted ragdoll. Then, lying flat, he raised one hand and sarcastically praised the genius craftsmen responsible, hoping they won awards, and stubbed their toe. Eventually, he pulled himself upright and called the Black Book. It materialized in a swirl of dark energy. He checked the glowing script inside. 5:30. 1 hour left. He glanced at the final fishbone beside him. Just one shot. He had already mapped out 10 of the 12 locks. He had to succeed now. Eyes narrowing, he picked up the fishbone, summoned every ounce of magical focus, and activated full power. His aura darkened, glowing with pulsing energy. Upstairs, golden light filled the kitchen as Anne and Noelle finished preparing dinner. The soup simmered, fresh lake fish, tofu, and scallions. Noelle tasted it and sighed happily, declaring it divine. Anne smiled, bottling the soup into a magical heat jar. She thanked Noelle for the help, saying everything turned out better with company. Noelle beamed, modestly brushing off the praise. Then she tilted her head curiously, noting how Anne had been learning new recipes constantly, even though the mansion had fewer people now, and they'd been eating fish every day. Anne froze briefly. The floating knives by her cutting board paused midair, her voice stayed calm. Noelle leaned in playfully. She asked if Anne had secretly adopted a cat, maybe that explained all the food disappearing. Still silent, Anne finally turned and pressed a finger to her lips, asking Noelle to keep a secret. Noelle saluted with a grin, claiming she loved cats and had grown up with 12 at her grandmother's. But before Anne could slip away, Noelle added one more request. Could she come see the cats sometime? Anne paused, then gave a soft, regretful smile. She said the little one was still shy, but promised Noelle would be the first to meet it when the time was right. Once alone, Anne opened a hidden passage within the mansion. The soup wasn't for a cat, it was for Moon. She walked the secret staircase in silence, her mind replaying Noelle's words. Maybe the young master was growing bored down there. Still, she felt relief. Noelle hadn't suspected the truth. If she had, things might have gotten complicated, too complicated. Meanwhile, in the hidden basement, Moon crouched, drenched in sweat and stress, the final fishbone trembling in his grip. The air was tight with tension. As Anne made her way back through the mansion, she pressed a hand to her abdomen and whispered that no strange feeling has come, so she wasn't pregnant yet. There was still time. Still, her mind wandered. Perhaps she should get a pet for the young master. Something comforting. A fluffy golden cat? A sleek black one? She smiled at the idea and promised herself she'd ask him directly. Then, crack. Deep in the hidden passage, the lock gave way. She dropped the tray in shock as she approached the wide-open door. Moon had done it. Without hesitation, he wrapped a blanket around himself. There were no clothes, and slipped through the heavy iron door into the dark, cluttered corridor. Dust swirled in the air. It smelled of stone, mildew, and forgotten things. He whispered to himself that he was finally free, his eyes darting across the maze of boxes and broken crates, but after only a few steps, he tripped over a wooden plank and crashed to the floor. Groaning, he sat up in pitch-black darkness. Then he remembered a spell he had always dismissed as useless. He raised his hand and murmured, "Illumination." A soft glow bloomed in his palm, casting warm light across the tunnel. Shadows shrank away. He smirked. Not so useless after all. But before he could take a step, thwack, a knife embedded itself in the crate beside his head. His blood ran cold. His breath caught. Slowly, he turned toward the shadows behind him. There was nothing, but he could feel it. And, far down the passage, glowing eyes had already locked onto him. She stood still, one arm outstretched from the throw, her presence radiating with magical pressure. She whispered, "Found you, young master." Without warning, she launched toward him, a blur of motion powered by sheer fury and magic. Moon stared at the blade beside his face, panic setting in. He spun around, blanket flailing behind him as he ran through the cluttered tunnel. He cursed under his breath. He hadn't gone through all this just to be caught now. Every sleepless night in the book's simulation, every trap, every misdirection, all of it had led to this moment. He couldn't fail. With a surge of will, he activated Shadow Step. His legs ignited with dark energy, and his body blurred, flickering ahead with impossible speed. He zipped between crates and shadows, slipping through the narrow gaps of the sewer's maze. Behind him, Anne raised her hand. Blades shimmered into existence around her like stars forming in the sky. With a flick, they launched in a deadly wave. The projectiles tore through the tunnel, splintering crates, shattering barrels, and cracking stone. Explosions roared in every direction. Even Anne was caught in the chaos. A massive crate flew toward her from the shockwave. Without missing a beat, she raised one leg and kicked it midair, splintering it on impact. A few shards grazed her stockings, but she didn't blink. She landed gracefully amidst the ruin. The sewer was wrecked, but Moon had vanished. Anne scanned the chaos, eyes narrowing. Her voice carried through the dust, equal parts irritation and admiration. She whispered that she had underestimated him. But she warned, no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape her. What she didn't know was that Moon was mere feet behind her, wedged tightly inside a wooden cabinet. He held his breath, heart hammering so loud he feared she'd hear it. Anne stood still for a moment, then offered a deal. If he came out now, she wouldn't chase him anymore. She'd forget all this happened. He didn't move. She turned sharply, firing a blast of energy into a crate nearby. Boom. Wrong one. Inside his hiding spot, Moon flinched. The explosion sent dust into the cracks, choking the air. His hands trembled, eyes burning with unshed tears. Maybe, he whispered to himself, maybe he should just give up. At least in the basement, he had food. Safety. Anne took care of him. But even as she hovered in the air, searching for signs, Anne found nothing. No shift in wind. No magical signature. Was he really gone? With a flick of her hand, she summoned her wings again and lifted off, vanishing down the tunnel in search of him. 10 minutes passed. The dust began to settle. Silence returned. Moon hadn't moved. His breath was shallow, body tense, every muscle waiting. Still no footsteps. No energy spikes. No movement. He finally exhaled. Looks like she really left, he whispered. He reached for the cabinet door, hand trembling with relief. But the moment his fingers touched the handle, he froze. His eyes widened in horror. A chilling presence swept through the tunnel, followed by a deafening boom. Anne stood before a shattered crate, magic still crackling around her. Her red eyes glowed faintly as she scanned the wreckage. Empty again. She stared at it, disappointed, and quietly questioned if she had imagined something. Then, conjuring a thin blade of magic into her hand, she decided it didn't matter. She stated that she must find the young master before anyone else did. Moving quickly, she worried the other maids, especially Noel. might uncover the secret she had worked so hard to hide. She had to bring him back, discreetly and fast. Meanwhile, Moon hadn't moved. Not because he was hiding. He had fainted. The shock of Anne's sudden return and the explosion had overwhelmed him. He sat dazed, mouth slightly open, lost in space. Then, thunk. A light tap on his head. He blinked. A second knock, softer. He gasped awake and panicked instantly, convinced she was back. In a frenzy, he burst out of the cabinet, tripped on a wooden shard, and landed face first on the ground. When he looked up, he saw it. The black book, floating calmly in the air. He clutched his chest and muttered that it was just the book, not her. Still shaking, he reminded himself that she had returned, and he had passed out. Now, he was alone. He checked the book. Half an hour left. He calculated that he had 30 minutes before she doubled back or searched the exits. His expression hardened. He had no time to waste. She might be nearby, or worse, waiting outside. He summoned his energy. Purple shadows surged through his veins. Shadow step, full power. He launched forward, twisting through the sewers until a faint glow appeared ahead, the exit, but a massive wooden cabinet blocked the path. Gritting his teeth, he rammed into it, pushing just enough space to squeeze through. He pulled himself up and into the open air. Rain pounded him instantly. He looked up. The sky over the Duke's mansion was a storm of black clouds. Lightning split the sky. Thunder followed, shaking the ground. He stood still in the downpour, soaked and trembling, but free. He raised his hands and let the rain wash over his face like a baptism. His voice shook with awe as he said he'd made it out. Then, laughing through the storm, he spun in place and shouted that this was freedom. He froze, slapped both hands over his mouth, and reminded himself not to shout. She could still hear. He scanned the area. No glowing eyes, no pressure, she was gone. He muttered that light magic had given him away before and he wouldn't make that mistake again. He exhaled. He needed to escape the mansion, the capital, everything. He hadn't risked all of this just to be dragged back. And so, he ran. Into the rain. Into freedom, or whatever was left of it. The sky over Belland Plain began to clear. Early rain faded, and a stretch of blue slowly pushed through the clouds. Moon lay sprawled on the grass, arms and legs stretched as if gravity had finally shown mercy. His chest rose slowly. He whispered that after 2 days and 2 nights, he had finally escaped the capital. The wind brushed his cheek gently. After so much tension, the quiet felt unreal. Too peaceful. Tempted by the calm, he considered a nap, but reminded himself he wasn't safe. Anne was still out there. With a breath, he stood, dusted off, and looked toward the horizon. He thought about the distance. Either Campbell Territory or Santa Maria College. College was closer. Without delay, he moved to Lake Belland's edge. He knelt, splashed the cold water on his face, and jolted his senses awake. He scrubbed away the dirt clinging to his skin and hair. He whispered to himself to keep the momentum going and head straight for Santa Maria. Then, voices. Rough. Across the lake. One man shouted, demanding to know if they thought he was dead. Moon turned sharply. On the far side stood 3 men and a girl. The men wore mismatched cloaks, visible weapons, and the kind of swagger that screamed bandits. The leader, wearing a red cloak and a scar over one eye, smirked confidently. A braid dangled from his shoulder. His 2 flanks, one with a red ribbon over his eye, the other bald and built like a boulder, stood beside him. The bald one carried a sword the size of a door. In front of them stood a girl, young, calm, and composed. A burgundy cloak draped over her shoulders. A basket of vegetables in one hand. A wand in the other. She looked like she'd just returned from the market. She declared that she was an adventurer and asked if they were ready to face the consequences. The scarred man scoffed and said that while she might be a magician, she was alone. No backup. No muscle. As he taunted her, she quietly stepped back. Her grip on the wand tightened. She was calculating, not afraid. She pointed out how bold it was to rob people in broad daylight and asked if they weren't worried a hero might show up. The scarred man laughed and said that no hero was coming. They'd already scouted the area. He then proudly explained their process. The man in the white cloak raised his hand dramatically and said they made a plan in advance. The bald one added that they always cleared the work route. Then, in sync, they proclaimed that they identified the target and made sure everything was foolproof. That, they said, was professionalism. They looked smug. Too smug. The girl remained steady, still stepping back, wand in hand. The leader suddenly drew his sword. The blade gleamed in the morning sun. He warned her not to move again, saying he knew she was trying to gain casting distance. One more step, and he'd slice her wand hand off. She froze, gripped tight on the wand. The leader flicked his fangs and mocked the idea of a hero. He told her no one was coming. They had made sure of it. Then, a splash. A figure shot across the lake like a dart. Messy blonde hair, tattered clothes, but a posture full of reckless purpose. Moon had arrived. He shouted across the water, telling the bandits to back off. Water streamed down his arms as he scrambled ashore, chest heaving and hands planted on his hips. His arrival startled the three men. The two subordinates yelped and ducked behind their leader. The one in white squinted and pointed out that he recognized the hair and clothes. He exclaimed that it was the blonde mermaid. The bald one corrected him irritably, saying that it was clearly a guy. Moon stepped forward and called out the obvious. 3 against 1? If they were really so bold, he challenged them to try him instead. To his surprise, the scarred leader smirked and agreed without hesitation. Moon blinked, confused by how fast things had shifted. The leader waved his hand, signaling the girl was free to go. His two henchmen exchanged confused glances, not understanding the change in plan. But the girl didn't budge. She stayed where she was, silent under her hood. Moon grew nervous. He gestured to his ragged appearance, explaining he had nothing of value, not even spare change. He half-joked that he could get their contact info and wire money later as a gesture of goodwill. The scarred man laughed and calmly sheathed his blade. He said he wasn't interested in money. With a dark glint in his eye, he explained that Moon wasn't just some wanderer. He was a rarity. Then he declared that he had changed his mind. He ordered his men to capture him instead. His henchmen hesitated for half a second before moving in. Moon's eyes went wide with panic. This was not how it was supposed to go. He turned and ran, yelling that he was only trying to help, demanding to know why this was happening to him. The three men gave chase, their laughter echoing through the field. Behind them, still and silent, the girl watched. Her grip on the wand in her hand tightened. Then she closed her eyes, whispering a chant under her breath. She called upon the spirits of fire. Red sparks crackled around her wand as the air shimmered. Then, without warning, flames exploded outward in a roaring wave, consuming the field ahead. A deafening boom followed. The bandits' laughter turned to screams. Moon skidded to a stop at the lake's edge and turned around. His eyes went wide at the sight of a wall of fire lighting up the landscape behind him. Heat brushed his face as awe set in. The girl stepped calmly forward and announced that the bandits had been dealt with. She called out to him, referring to him cheekily as Mr. Mermaid. Moon blinked, surprised by the nickname, and the fact she had just saved him. She nodded and thanked him, saying his interference gave her the opening she needed. Moon scratched the back of his head, flustered by the praise. He said there was no need to thank him, her magic had been incredible. She looked at him curiously and asked if wandering the wilderness dressed like that was a city dweller's hobby. Moon froze, realizing how ridiculous he looked. His clothes were torn, soaked, barely holding together. He stammered that it wasn't like that, he hadn't had time to change before escaping. Trying to shift the mood, he smiled and introduced himself. He said his name was Moon and that he was currently between jobs. The girl replied evenly. She was Aluca, a former adventurer now trying to learn how to be a good wife. Moon raised an eyebrow and asked if she was married. She smiled gently and touched her cheeks, clearly pleased. She said she had just gotten married last night. A ring sparkled on her hand. Moon nodded cheerfully and wished her and her husband a wonderful life, full of happiness and warmth. Aluca looked surprised at first, but then gave him a genuine smile. Then, an audible growl from Moon's stomach. Silence followed for a beat. Aluca raised an eyebrow and asked if he was hungry. Moon laughed awkwardly, rubbing his head, and admitted he hadn't eaten in 2 days. He'd been running for his life. Before he could finish, Aluca told him to come with her. She said she had food and was heading home to cook anyway. He'd catch a cold in those clothes. And her husband had extras in his size he could borrow. Moon's eyes lit up. He asked if she really meant it, clothes and a meal? Aluca smiled gently, saying they were just old clothes. He shouldn't expect much. Moon clasped his hands together, overwhelmed with gratitude. He called her a treasure among people, a guardian angel, a noble soul. Aluca laughed and replied that flattery might earn him a second helping. Maybe. As they walked through the rain together, Moon looked up at the sky and whispered that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to turn around. Moon, curious about Aluca's presence in such a remote area, asked her why she was out here so soon after getting married. He couldn't understand why she wasn't at home with her husband, especially given the risk of encountering bandits. Aluca explained that she was simply running errands in town, tasks related to her husband's work, as well as picking up groceries. Since both of them had been adventurers, she and Rod had recently decided to retire from that life after getting married. She mentioned needing to report the decision to the guild, as remaining inactive too long could lead to them being marked as deceased. With the subject shifting to dinner, she suggested they have fish. Moon immediately brightened at the idea, revealing that fish was his favorite. But in the midst of that warm moment, something strange happened. A soft, chilling whisper reached his ear, just barely audible, carrying words that unsettled him. He froze and looked around, but there was no one. When he mentioned it to Aluca, she seemed genuinely unaware, claiming she hadn't heard anything at all. Moon tried to brush it off as a trick of hunger and fatigue. They soon reached the village, and Moon was surprised by the size of the house Aluca led him to. It was far more spacious than he expected for a young couple. Aluca clarified with a gentle smile that the house wasn't theirs. It belonged to the village chief. She and Rod were only staying there temporarily. That lingering unease pushed Moon to ask another question. The village was eerily quiet. There hadn't been a single person on the road, and every home they passed had its door left wide open. He asked if no one was concerned about thieves or intruders. Aluca paused, lowering her gaze for a moment, before offering an explanation. The silence, she said, was because the entire village was currently occupied. A nearby lake, Lake Beeple, just 5 li from the village, was the key to their livelihood. The soil here was too poor for farming, so the villagers depended entirely on the autumn fish harvest. The fish they caught were sold to nobles, and the profits from that single season were enough to sustain the village through the year. She explained that Rod, her husband, now used his adventuring skills to escort the fishing parties and transport the catch to the city, a journey that took several days. While he was away, she remained behind to manage the village in his absence. Moon now understood the silence and the open doors. Everyone was out working. It was hard, demanding labor, but it made sense. Yet even as that explanation settled his curiosity, the whisper returned. This time, it came with a presence. Cold, intimate, and closer than before. He turned again, certain someone or something was there, but once more saw nothing. Doubt crept into him. Was this just imagination, or was something else at play? Inside the chief's house, Aluca handed him a clean set of clothes and a cup of boiled water. She mentioned there was water outside if he wanted to bathe and that dinner would be ready soon. Moon, still cautious from past experiences, examined the water carefully before drinking. He checked for any unusual residue or scent and even tested a bit on his skin. There was no sign of poison, it was just water, plain and safe. Everything Aluca said and did fit together logically, yet something still felt wrong, even if he couldn't say what. When dinner was served, Moon ate the fish eagerly and complimented Aluca's cooking. He compared it favorably to meals prepared by his maid at home, adding that Aluca would surely make a wonderful wife. Aluca responded modestly, brushing off the compliment as too generous for a simple meal. Still, she picked up on his mention of a maid and remarked that he clearly wasn't an ordinary traveler. Moon decided it was time to reveal who he was. He told her he belonged to the Campbell family, one of the Empire's great ducal houses. His full name was Moon Campbell, son of Duke Ronan Campbell. At present, he was a fugitive, being hunted for reasons he didn't yet want to share. He asked if she could help him, using her guild status to secure a horse or carriage and deliver a letter to his family. Aluca was amused at the request and joked that she'd expected something far grander, perhaps even a demand for a fortune to reclaim a noble title. Moon responded with complete seriousness, offering her 20,000 emeralds once the task was done. She teased again, questioning if he planned to name her Lady of Belrand too, but his expression never changed. He was sincere. He told her this was urgent and needed to be taken seriously. Aluca had already planned to let him stay the night. With beasts roaming the forests at night, it was too dangerous to travel after dark. She told him she'd show him to his room shortly. Before she left him to rest, She issued a strict warning. He was not to wander the house, and under no circumstances was he to open any doors. Especially not the last door at the end of the hallway. Behind it, she said, were freshly butchered animals hanging to dry. If that door were opened now, the scent of blood would fill the house and possibly attract predators. She also noted that the other rooms weren't hers to enter, so she expected the same respect from him. Moon gave his word that he wouldn't go exploring. She wished him good night and left, but once she turned away, her demeanor changed entirely. Her pleasant expression vanished, replaced by something far colder. In a low voice, she muttered that it was unfortunate he wouldn't live to see tomorrow. As she walked away, a red sigil began to emerge across her chest, glowing faintly beneath her clothing, like ink drawn by fire. She continued muttering softly, almost reverently, repeating that alive, the young master meant something, but dead, he would be nothing. She added one final, chilling phrase. He would be the last offering to the goddess of love. Elsewhere, Anne was on the move. She had been tracking Moon for some time and now had proof the trail was still fresh. A scrap of cloth caught on a branch still carried the scent of its owner. That scent belonged to the young master. Anne noted how far the boy had run, but didn't seem impressed. Escape was impossible. This hunt was already over. The target simply didn't know it yet. Back in the village, inside the chief's house, Moon had finally drifted into a deep sleep, unaware that every move he'd made had already been accounted for. Every choice had led him exactly where someone wanted him to be. Unaware that the next day might never come. In the dead of night, Moon woke suddenly, his bladder protesting the amount of water he'd drunk earlier. As he sat up, a sharp barking sound reached his ears from outside. For a moment, he wondered if Aluca kept a dog, though he didn't recall seeing one during the day. Curious, he stood and started to check. Before he could take more than a few steps, a voice behind him made him freeze. Aluca was there, asking why he was up so late. He explained that he had just woken with the urge to use the toilet. She acknowledged it casually, then responded to his question about the barking by claiming it was indeed her dog. According to her, it was the most handsome and well-behaved dog in the world, likely barking tonight because of hunger. Relieved that he hadn't imagined the sound, Moon said that he had always loved dogs and had dreamed of owning one for years. He asked if he could see it. Aluca turned him down gently, saying that her dog was shy around strangers and preferred staying hidden in its room. Accepting the explanation, Moon made his way toward the toilet. As he left, she reminded him not to mix up the doors. The toilet was right next to the well. Once he was out of her sight, her demeanor changed entirely. Her expression sharpened, her eyes cold and unreadable. At the toilet, Moon wrinkled his nose. The stench was intense, overpowering. He couldn't help but wonder if this place had ever been cleaned. Then the barking came again, louder this time, and from just ahead. The sound drew his attention to a nearby window, where he assumed the dog must be kept. Driven by curiosity, he edged closer, peering through a narrow gap. He expected to glimpse fur or paws, perhaps even a tail wagging. But what he saw instead made his blood run cold. Aluca was inside, speaking sweetly to someone kneeling on the floor. She told the person to eat up and stop barking. She added that Moon was still useful and urged him to endure a little longer. She would let him out tomorrow. The man she spoke to was chained, his eyes vacant and hollow. His posture was limp, more animal than human. Moon stepped back instinctively, horrified, but a twig cracked beneath his foot. Aluca's voice rang out sharply, demanding to know who was there. She opened the window with a jolt but found no one. It seemed she believed it had been her imagination. In truth, Moon had silently leapt above the window frame, heart pounding as he watched her from the shadows. She had appeared so gentle, so harmless, yet here she was feeding a man like a dog. And not just any man. The face was identical to the photo displayed in the hallway. This was her husband. He realized then how much danger he was in. Escaping from one obsessive captor only to land in the grasp of another, even more unhinged. The village's silence now took on a more sinister meaning. Everything felt wrong. The way Aluca spoke, the whispers in the dark, the god of love she mentioned. Staying here was no longer an option. Without hesitation, Moon activated Shadow's step and vanished from the house, slipping into the night. Back inside, Aluca walked calmly to his room and knocked softly, asking if he was there. When there was no response, she pushed the door open and found it empty. A surge of power rippled through her. She punched the nearby cabinet, shattering it into splinters. Anger flared. She cursed, wondering when he had figured things out. Before she could act further, another knock came at the door. Her expression narrowed. Could it be him returning? She opened the door with hope, but froze. Standing there was someone unexpected. She quickly recovered and smiled, greeting the visitor warmly. Inside, Anne, dressed in a maid outfit, was addressed as Master, and Aluca commented on the choice of attire, calling it adorable. Anne explained that she had left the estate in a hurry and hadn't had time to change. She also questioned why Aluca referred to her as Master, insisting she had never taught her anything. Aluca responded enthusiastically. She said that it was those very words from Anne that had given her the courage to become her true self. Because of her, she dared to confess to her beloved Rod. Aluca then brightened, asking if Anne would like to see the result of her efforts. Anne agreed to wait, but her nose twitched. There was a faint trace of moon scent lingering in the air, mixed with something darker, blood. Soon, Aluca returned, leading a man by a chain. Anne raised an eyebrow at the sight. Aluca introduced him proudly as her beloved husband, telling Rod to say hello. The man gave a low, submissive bark and blinked up at them. Anne chuckled at the scene, commenting that apparently some couples lived like this. Aluca dismissed the remark modestly, saying that compared to her guest, she still had a long way to go. She claimed that her guest would have already made her lover submit fully, both body and soul. But Anne didn't take the praise lightly. She admitted that it was her own carelessness that had allowed her young master to escape. The words clicked in Aluca's mind, and she asked if her guest's lover was Mr. Moon. Realizing the connection, Anne's expression shifted. She asked where he was now. Aluca confirmed that Moon had been here earlier. She led her guest to the room he had stayed in and explained that she had found him on the road that afternoon, dressed in rags. Out of pity, she had let him stay. But earlier in the night, she had heard a noise and discovered the room empty. Moon had been gone for less than 2 hours, she added quickly. Reassuring N, she mentioned that she had learned a hunter's tracking spell, one that could reveal footprints even at night. She was confident that if they left immediately, they could still catch him. As she began preparing the spell, she issued a final warning. She told Anne not to wander around, as the house didn't belong to her, and certain rooms were better left unopened. It was safest to remain right where she was. Anne agreed without protest and said she would wait. Once Aluca had left the room, Anne lay down on the bed Moon had used earlier, clutching the pillow tightly to her chest. She whispered to herself, addressing the boy who had fled. She questioned whether he truly despised her that much, to have crossed 3 cities just to escape her. The scent on the pillow still lingered, and the weight of his absence hung over her like a curse. Then, from the corner of the room, a low sound caught her attention. Aluca's husband, Rod, was still there, slumped in the shadows like a forgotten relic. A faint cry escaped him, as if his broken mind was briefly resurfacing. He mumbled, trembling, repeating that everything was gone. His voice shook with fear and something deeper, awareness clawing its way back to the surface. Anne hurried to his side, asking if he was all right. Rod's grip tightened around her hand with sudden intensity. His voice rasped a warning. She needed to leave. Now. And under no circumstances was she to go near the last room. His gaze then drifted into emptiness again, as if whatever sanity had returned was now lost once more. Anne felt her stomach twist. The way he'd spoken made it clear. This place was far more dangerous than it appeared. She knew she had no time to waste. Driven by instinct and dread, she made her way through the hall, stopping before the final door. It was locked. With a simple incantation, she cast a spell that forced it open. The wood splintered beneath the power, and the door swung inward with a low creak. A stench of blood surged out like a living thing, choking the air. The moment she stepped inside, her body went rigid. Scattered across the room were corpses. Villagers butchered and discarded like livestock. Their lifeless forms were sprawled in various states of decay. And at the center, nailed to a cross, hung a woman. Anne recognized her instantly. It was Dia, once a fellow adventurer in Aluca's party. A freezing shiver climbed Anne's spine. Could this all have been Aluca's doing? The thought twisted through her like ice. Then a voice spoke behind her. Aluca was there, her expression calm, her voice low and oddly affectionate. She said she'd been found out, but insisted that it was fine. She claimed that the two of them were the same kind, that Anne would come to understand her. She spoke of love, twisted and obsessive, saying that her feelings were real. She professed her devotion openly, declaring that she loved Anne. Anne's response was cold. She said Aluca had been corrupted by the evil god. But Aluca laughed behind her hands and then burst into unhinged laughter, eyes shining with fervor. She accused Anne of blasphemy, saying it was wrong to speak that way of the god of love. With manic intensity, she explained that the god had shown her kindness, had granted her power to fulfill her deepest wish, to love everyone completely. When Anne pressed her, asking what price had been paid for such a blessing, Aluca's reply was chilling. There had been no price. The god had asked for nothing, only that she embrace her true self. She insisted again that they were alike, but she added that her devotion was still incomplete. One final person remained. One last offering. She smiled sweetly and asked Anne to accept her love. Anne's gaze hardened. She said that Aluca was too far gone. Without hesitation, Aluca raised her weapon. Her voice was disturbingly gentle as she promised to be merciful, to cut Anne's throat softly so that it wouldn't hurt. But Anne moved first. She released the iron prison, a binding technique, and in one fluid motion summoned her dagger, striking Aluca's throat with practiced precision. Blood splattered across the walls as Aluca dropped to her knees, hands trembling. Anne spoke softly, an apology laced with sorrow. She said she couldn't allow Aluca to harm anyone else. Aluca's voice trembled as she stared up at her. She didn't understand. She said she had only given love. She insisted she hadn't hurt anyone. She only loved them. Anne snapped back that it wasn't love. Aluca seemed to falter. She asked what it was then, if not love. She claimed that taking everything from the ones she loved was exactly what love meant. Wasn't that what Anne had taught her? Anne could only whisper another apology. The truth weighed heavily on her. The evil god's influence had warped Aluca's mind, twisted her beliefs until love became a weapon. Somewhere in that transformation, Anne knew her own carelessness had played a part. Aluca's madness was, in part, her doing. She promised that once she found Moon again, she would return and give Aluca the burial she deserved. Then, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and slow, repeating the same phrase again and again. I love you. Blood seeped from the floor, pooling unnaturally, swirling as if alive. The air thickened. From that crimson pool, something began to form. Something monstrous, ancient, and divine. Anne recognized it immediately. The god's true body had arrived. Meanwhile, Moon was still running. His breath ragged, legs aching. After what felt like hours, he finally slowed, believing he had put enough distance between himself and that cursed village. He thought it was safe. He allowed himself a moment to rest. But before he could even catch his breath, a figure hurtled toward him with impossible speed. The impact shattered the trees nearby, leaving a smoking crater in the forest floor. Moon froze, stunned. It felt like a meteor had struck the earth. As the dust began to settle, a familiar figure emerged, battered, bleeding, but unmistakably alive. Anne stood before him, her expression tight with urgency. She said she'd finally found him, confirming that he had really come this far. Moon rushed forward, asking how she'd gotten hurt, what had happened, who she'd fought. He asked if she could still stand. Anne didn't answer those questions. Her focus was sharp. She warned him that there was no time. He needed to run. She would handle what came next, and then, it came. The presence was suffocating. A towering figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting between flesh and something far worse. A voice called out sweetly, filled with madness. It was Aluca. Or what remained of her. Now fully consumed by the god, she had become something monstrous. An avatar of love twisted into horror. Her voice rang out across the clearing, searching. She asked where her master was. She said she loved them. And as she stepped forward, eyes glowing and inhuman, she called to Moon directly. She told him to come. She asked him to accept her love. And she promised that they would become one. He stared up at the pulsing mass sprawled across the ceiling, an obscene, blood-red tangle of tendons, veins, and twitching eyes. The thing writhed like something half-formed and wholly wrong. He voiced his confusion aloud, wanting to know what exactly he was looking at. In response, the fleshy blossom peeled open, revealing a grotesque maw of blinking eyes and quivering muscle. A voice oozed from within, syrupy and bright with madness. It greeted Mr. Moon warmly, saying it recognized him, and added, almost as an afterthought, that it loved him too. The thing stirred as if delighted by his presence. A sudden rain of scarlet limbs hurled down like spears. Moon staggered back, heart pounding, breath torn from his lungs. He fled into the open night, only one name rising to his mind, Aluca. Then, from the side, a blur of motion. Anne surged into view. She shouted for the young master to take cover, flung an arm around his waist, and yanked him aside just as a shockwave of crimson energy tore the ground where they'd been standing moments before. The impact sent them tumbling, grit grinding beneath her boots as heat licked her back. A sharp sting bloomed along her calf. Flying debris had sliced her. He forced himself upright, cursing under his breath. Of course there had been something wrong with Aluca. He hissed that it hurt. The maid steadied him and he said her name, Anne. He pointed down, warning her that his feet were bleeding. She drew a breath and insisted she was fine. She stepped ahead of him, eyes hard. She said she would stop the enemy here and that the young master must escape, immediately. He began to object, but she cut him off, promising she would finish the battle and return to his side, bringing him safely back to the Duke's mansion when it was over. The forest ahead rippled as if something massive breathed through it. The darkness burst open in a tide of living red. A voice emerged from the crimson swell, purring that it had found its master again in Mr. Moon. The monstrous form expanded, tendrils rearing high as if eager for an embrace. It murmured that the timing was perfect. Then it screamed, demanding that they accept its love together. Anne stood firm, exhaling through clenched teeth as silvered shadow pooled at her feet. Moon thought that his shadow step had reached 200% and vowed to unleash his full firepower. The world blurred as the attack rushed at them. Moon dashed behind her, reaching out and pulling her away just before another bladed limb could reach her. Mid-dash, she turned her head and asked why he had come back. His voice was tight, his answer sharp. He said she couldn't lie. If she truly could defeat the monster, she would have already done so. The fact that she told him to run proved she had doubts. As another wave of red slammed down around them, he planted his feet and swept her into his arms. He told her plainly that even if she'd wronged him in the past, she was still his maid, and he wasn't about to stand by and watch her die. With a grim spark in his eyes, he added that, when it came to running away, he was a professional. He turned and burst into motion, Anne held tightly in his arms. Red spears sliced the air behind them, missing by inches. The ground erupted in jagged waves as the two of them wove through the chaos, darting through collapsing trees and fractured stone. Breathless, the sound of his breathing cracked and uneven. He gasped out fragments of words, trying to speak between wheezing chuckles. Anne caught his arm to steady him and called him young master. He met her gaze and told her they were almost safe. Just a little farther. But then, from over the next ridge, the crimson horror rose again. It screamed that they must accept its love, bellowing once more that it loved them. Moon pulled Anne close and instructed her to hold on and not let go. She stiffened, alarmed by his sudden tone, and questioned his intent, but before she could say more, he took off running and dove forward. They hit the water hard. Submerged beneath the surface, he watched the scarlet tide churn along the shoreline above. His mind raced. If his instincts were correct, the creature's body couldn't maintain cohesion underwater. That ability, it came with a weakness. He scanned the writhing form at the water's edge. Just as he suspected, it was unraveling, its shape no longer stable. He glanced at Anne beside him. She was struggling. His eyes narrowed with confusion. She couldn't swim. Without hesitation, he wrapped an arm around her. He hadn't expected things to go sideways now, but there was no helping it. He pulled her closer and pressed his mouth to hers, sharing his breath to keep her afloat. The two of them clung together in the blue stillness beneath the surface while the monster above slowly fell apart, unable to hold its form. On the shore, the creature's eyes scanned the water. It muttered that the scent of blood had vanished. It wailed that its love was so pure. Why wouldn't they accept it? Its voice cracked with grief. It screamed the question again. Why? Then, slowly, the massive form calmed. Thorns twitched like dying nerves. It whispered that perhaps it didn't matter anymore. Just one last offering remained. A sacrifice to the god of love. And though it admitted it was reluctant, it promised to go through with it. Its voice softened into a croon as it spoke to the pair beneath the waves. It told them to wait, to be patient. It would return. And when it did, it vowed, it would become a true god. And then they would have no choice but to accept its love.